In 1936, the British Empire did not fall to war, rebellion, or economic collapse. Instead, it was shaken by something far quieter and far more dangerous, a king who refused to play the role expected of him. The Abdication Crisis was not merely a love story, as it was later simplified for public comfort. It was a constitutional earthquake, a political emergency, and a carefully managed cover-up that reshaped the British monarchy forever. Edward V ascended the throne in January 1936 following the death of his father, King George V. From the moment he became king, Edward was already seen as a problem. He was charming, modern, emotional, and impulsive, traits that appealed to the public but deeply unsettled the political establishment. A British monarch, after all, was not meant to rule by feeling. He was meant to reign silently, symbolically, and obediently within constitutional limits. At the centre of the crisis stood Wallis Simpson, an American socialite who had already been divorced once and was in the process of divorcing her second husband. Edward was determined to marry her. To him, this was a personal matter. To the British government and the Church of England, it was an impossibility. As Supreme Governor of the Church, the king could not marry a divorced woman with living former husbands. But this was only the surface problem. Behind closed doors, the situation appeared far more alarming. Senior ministers, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, began receiving intelligence reports that troubled them deeply. Edward V was not politically neutral. He expressed opinions openly, criticised government policies, and showed little respect for constitutional restraint. Worse still, Wallis Simpson herself became the subject of discreet surveillance. Intelligence services feared that her social connections, particularly with European elites, posed a potential national security risk at a time when fascism was rising across the continent. None of this was shared with the British public. Instead, a decision was made. The press would remain silent. Newspapers agreed, under immense pressure, not to report the king's relationship. While foreign tabloids openly discussed the affair, British citizens remained largely unaware of the true crisis unfolding at the heart of their monarchy. This silence was not accidental. It was orchestrated. As Edward insisted on marrying Wallis, Baldwin presented him with three options. The first was to abandon the marriage. The second was a morganatic marriage, in which Wallis would not become queen, an idea swiftly rejected by the government. The third was abdication. Edward chose abdication. On December 11th, 1936, he signed the instrument of abdication, becoming the first British monarch to voluntarily give up the throne. In a radio broadcast later that day, he told the nation he could not carry the heavy burden of kingship without the woman he loved. The speech was carefully scripted, emotionally powerful, and deliberately incomplete. What it did not mention were the files. What it did not mention were the months of private negotiations, the intelligence concerns, the constitutional panic, and the deep mistrust between the king and his own government. What it did not mention was that Edward had already lost the confidence of those meant to support him. After his abdication, Edward was granted the title Duke of Windsor. Wallis would never receive the title of Her Royal Highness, a decision that was not ceremonial but punitive. Financial arrangements were strictly controlled. Invitations were rare. Access to the royal family was limited. The punishment was exile, polite, quiet, and permanent. Many of the most sensitive documents related to the crisis were sealed for decades. When some were eventually released, they revealed a far colder reality than the romantic myth suggested. Officials questioned Edward's judgment, his loyalty, and his understanding of his role. The monarchy had not lost a king to love. It had removed a liability. The consequences of the abdication crisis echoed for generations. Edward's younger brother, Albert, became King George II, unprepared, anxious, and painfully aware that he was never meant to rule. His struggle with speech and confidence was not merely personal, it was the direct result of a system forced into emergency succession. George VI's reign would later be defined by duty, restraint, and quiet endurance, the exact opposite of his brother's temperament. And because George VI became king, his daughter Elizabeth would one day inherit the crown. Queen Elizabeth II's reign, marked by discipline, silence, and emotional control, was shaped by the trauma of 1936. The monarchy she embodied was not warm or expressive. It was defensive, cautious, and obsessed with stability. The Abdication Crisis taught the British royal family a brutal lesson. Emotion was dangerous, transparency was risky, and survival required secrecy. From that moment on, the monarchy tightened its grip on narrative and image. Scandals were buried, files were locked away, public perception became as carefully managed as state policy. The Crown would never again allow one individual to threaten the institution so openly. Edward VIII lived out the rest of his life in quiet displacement. He attended social gatherings, gave interviews, and occasionally hinted at bitterness. But he never returned to power. He was never forgiven. History remembers him as the king who chose love, but the files suggest he was the king who was no longer trusted. The Abdication Crisis of 1936 was not a fairy tale, it was a warning that the crown does not belong to the person who wears it, it belongs to the system that protects itself at all costs. And when a king forgets that truth, the institution does not hesitate to erase him, politely, legally, and without mercy. This was not the end of a reign. It was the beginning of a colder monarchy, one built on silence, exile, and the careful hiding of inconvenient truths. Close your eyes now, and let the modern world dissolve into the soft grey mist of an English winter. Imagine yourself drifting backward, past the noise of the decades until the air grows still and cold, smelling of damp wool, coal smoke, and the heavy, oiled leather of official dispatch boxes. We are standing in the quiet corridors of Sandringham House in Norfolk. It is January 1936. The light is dim here, filtered through heavy velvet curtains that have been drawn against the biting wind coming off the North Sea. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. Now, let the silence return. Can you hear the clocks? There are hundreds of them in this house, ticking in a synchronized, rhythmic heartbeat. But here is a secret immediately whispered by the walls: the time is wrong. For years, King George V has insisted that all clocks at Sandringham be set 30 minutes fast, a quirk known as Sandringham time, designed to squeeze an extra half hour of daylight out of the hunting season. Now, it is a small, stubborn attempt to control nature itself, much like the king's attempt to control his children. But tonight, time is running out, regardless of what the clock face says. We are hovering outside the king's bedchamber. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of camphor and hothouse flowers, a cloying sweetness that tries to mask the smell of sickness. George V, the symbol of the old world, the man who held the empire together through the Great War, is drifting away. He is 70 years old, his lungs scarred by years of heavy smoking, his body tired. Around his bed, the atmosphere is not just one of grief, but of careful, calculated management. In the shadows of the room stands the king's physician, Lord Dawson of Penn. He checks his pocket watch, his face unreadable in the low light. He is not merely a doctor, he is a guardian of the dignity of the crown, and he has a decision to make, one that historians still debate with a mixture of fascination and unease. The king is close to death, but he is lingering. If he dies too late in the night, the news will miss the morning deadline for the Times, the paper of record, and will instead be announced in the less appropriate evening journals. To Lord Dawson, this is unacceptable. The death of a king must be timed as precisely as a state procession, and so, in a move that would remain a secret for 50 years, Dawson prepares a syringe. It is a lethal cocktail of morphine and cocaine. He notes it in his diary with the clinical detachment of a man adjusting a clock. He acts to ensure a peaceful end. Yes, but also to ensure the timing suits the dignity of the institution. He injects the king. The breathing slows. The old order fades, not by nature's hand alone, but with a little administrative assistance. It is just before midnight on January 20th when the silence becomes absolute. The king is dead. Long live the king. And now the camera of our mind shifts to the man standing in the doorway. He is 41 years old, but he looks boyish, his hair golden, his face unlined, a perpetual Prince Charming who seems allergic to gravity. This is David, now King Edward VIII. He does not look like a man crushed by the weight of a new crown. He looks like a man vibrating with nervous energy. He has spent his life waiting for this moment, not with reverence, but with a desperate desire to modernize, to sweep away the cobwebs of his father's Victorian world. One of his very first acts as king is symbolic, immediate, and jarring to the old retainers weeping in the halls. He orders the clocks of Sandringham to be set back. No more false time, no more living 30 minutes ahead of reality. He wants the truth. He wants the modern hour. It seems like a small, fresh change, a breath of air in a stuffy house. But the courtiers exchange glances. They know that to change the time is to challenge the order of things. And deep in the government archives in London, far away from the snowy silence of Norfolk, a file is already open. It contains not accolades for the new monarch, but reports, secret observations, worries about a certain car parked too often outside a certain flat in London. The king wants the correct time, but the establishment fears that he is about to set a time bomb ticking under the throne itself. The snow continues to fall outside, burying the tracks of the visitors, but inside the temperature has effectively dropped. The Victorian age is truly over. The Edwardian age has begun, and in the silence of the new reign, the first cracks in the foundation are already audible to those who know how to listen. The clocks have been set back, and with them, the rhythm of the monarchy shifts from the slow, steady tick of the Victorian era to the syncopated, unpredictable beat of the Jazz Age. We drift now from the cold silence of Sandringham to the bustling, soot-stained electric energy of London in the spring of 1936. The grieving period is officially over, and the capital is waking up to a phenomenon it has never seen before, a celebrity monarch. To understand the danger, we must first understand the dazzle. Edward VIII is not merely a ruler, he is a global obsession. Imagine him stepping out of a black limousine, the flashbulbs of press cameras popping like summer lightning, illuminating his face in stark silver bursts. He is undeniable. He is the most eligible bachelor in the world, a man who has been the Prince of Wales for so long that he has perfected the art of waving, smiling, and looking deeply interested in the mundane. To the coal miner in Wales, the shop girl in Manchester, and the veteran in the Shires, he is our David. He seems to possess a magical common touch, a way of leaning in when he speaks, as if sharing a conspiracy with the public against the stuffy men in grey suits who run the country. He hates high collars. He despises long sermons. He prefers a soft fedora to a top hat. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, but spiritually true, that he once horrified an ancient courtier by playing the bagpipes while sliding down a banister. A delightful image, though one suspects the bagpipes were an exaggeration, even if the sliding was not. The public loves him because he feels human. They see a king who flies his own airplanes, who uses American slang, who looks good in a bathing suit. They do not see the shadow. But shift your gaze now, away from the cheering crowds, and float through the thick oak doors of Whitehall, into the private offices of the government. Here, the air is still, smelling of stale pipe smoke, ink, and anxiety. To the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, and the King's own private secretaries, Edward is not a breath of fresh air. He is a suffocating draught that threatens to blow the papers off their desks. The business of being king is not waving, it is reading. Every day the monarch receives the red boxes, leather-bound cases filled with cabinet papers, Foreign Office telegrams, and secret intelligence reports. It is the king's duty to read them, sign them, and keep their contents holy. But Edward finds them boring. He calls the meticulous work of governance stopping the rot, a phrase he utters with a weary sigh. In the secret diaries of the time we find the true scale of the panic. Civil servants begin to notice that the red boxes are coming back from the king's residence, Fort Belvedere, looking untouched. Or, far worse, they come back stained with the rings of cocktail glasses. There are whispers, terrified whispers, that the king leaves these boxes open on tables during weekend parties, where any guest, waiter, or casual observer might glance down and read the secrets of the empire. It is the administrative equivalent of leaving the front door of the Bank of England open because the lock is too fiddly to operate. The friction between the man and the institution is grinding gears that have been oiled for centuries. This is where the tragedy begins to take shape. Edward believes his popularity is the same thing as power. He believes that because the people cheer him, he can rule as he pleases. He does not understand that the British Constitution is a delicate, invisible web that relies on the monarch doing exactly what he is told, only with great dignity. There is a moment that perfectly captures this disconnect, a moment historians still argue over with fierce intensity. In November, Edward visits the depressed mining villages of South Wales. He sees the poverty, the unemployed men standing in the rain with hollow faces, the closed collieries. Visibly moved, he turns to the cameras and says, "Something must be done." The public weeps with gratitude. The king cares, but in London the cabinet freezes in horror. To say something must be done implies the government is doing nothing. It is a political statement. It is a criticism. It is technically unconstitutional. Some historians view this as Edward's finest hour, a moment of genuine empathy from a man who wanted to help. Others, more cynical, suggest it was a performance, a way to boost his own ego while he was secretly neglecting his actual duties. They argue he was using the suffering of the miners as a backdrop for his own stardom. Whichever is true, the effect is the same. The government realizes they are dealing with a loose cannon on the deck of a very fragile ship. The silence in the corridors of power deepens. The private secretaries, men like the stern and disciplined Alec Hardinge, begin to write memos that they dare not send yet. They watch the king's schedule with dread. He cancels appointments at the last minute. He arrives late for ceremonies, looking bored. He is often unreachable by telephone, secluded at the fort, his private castle that feels less like a royal court and more like a wealthy playboy's country club. The contrast is jarring. On one side, you have the establishment, old men in tweed, obsessed with duty, tradition, and the quiet, invisible work of continuity. On the other, you have the king, vibrating with restless energy, obsessed with modernity, and treating the throne like a piece of furniture he has inherited but doesn't quite know where to put. And through it all, there is a sense of waiting. The ministers know something else is distracting the king. It is not just boredom. It is not just laziness. There is a magnetic pull drawing his attention away from the red boxes, away from the miners, away from the state papers. He is distracted by a voice, a presence, a force that has entered his life and swallowed it whole. The chaos of his reign is not accidental. It is the chaos of a man who is looking at the crown and seeing an obstacle to his own happiness. He is the most popular man in the world, yet he is profoundly lonely, surrounded by sycophants, but devoid of equals. He is searching for an anchor, but he has chosen one that the ship cannot support. As the spring of 1936 turns toward summer, the sunlight grows longer, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the great halls of Buckingham Palace, a palace Edward hates, calling it the sepulchre. He avoids sleeping there. He flees back to the fort every chance he gets. And it is there, in the privacy of the weekends, amidst the cocktail shakers and the jazz records and the unread state papers, that the true ruler of the king's heart holds court. The establishment is trembling, not just because the king is lazy, but because they know who is sitting beside him while the red boxes gather dust. The Prince of Charm is about to collide with the wall of reality, and he is driving the car at full speed, with the top down, convinced that the road will simply bend to accommodate him. What this moment quietly exposes is a shift in how power is felt rather than how it is exercised. Edward mistakes visibility for authority. In earlier eras, a king like George III or even Queen Victoria ruled by being distant, almost immobile, power expressed through restraint. Edward belongs instead to the age of radio stars and film idols, where attention itself feels like control. He is not trying to dismantle the system, he simply assumes it will follow his mood. There is a gentle parallel here with the late Roman emperors, especially figures like Commodus, who believed public affection and spectacle could substitute for administration. The crowd cheered, the machinery rusted, and no one noticed until it seized. Edward's tragedy is quieter but similar. He believes empathy spoken aloud is action completed. Why this matters is that constitutional monarchy survives only when the monarch agrees to be boring. Edward's refusal to be bored is not rebellion, it is misunderstanding. Some historians soften this judgment, arguing he sensed real social pain and spoke what ministers dared not. That may be true, yet intention cannot replace discipline. In the soft glow of popularity, Edward drifts further from the invisible web, holding the state together, unaware that admiration can vanish faster than duty ever does. The collision has a name, though at first it is whispered only in the drawing rooms of Mayfair and the smoky corners of high-end nightclubs. The name is Wallis. To understand the earthquake, we must first understand the fault line, and that fault line runs directly through the complex, fascinating and inscrutable figure of Bessie Wallace Warfield. She enters our story not as a villain twirling a moustache, nor as a helpless damsel, but as a burst of technicolor in a sepia-toned world. The camera of our history shifts now to the early 1930s, to a party scene that feels fragile and frenetic, like a glass of champagne trembling on the edge of a table. In this world of debutantes and dukes, where women are expected to be soft, floral and deferential, English roses with thorns buried very deep, Wallis Simpson is an orchid, angular, exotic, and impossible to ignore. She is American, of course, hailing from Baltimore, with a voice that cuts through the muffled vowels of the British aristocracy like a serrated knife. She is not, by the classical standards of the day, a great beauty. She has a strong jaw, piercing eyes, and a severe, almost geometric elegance, but she possesses something far more dangerous than beauty. She has style, and she has a terrifying amount of self-possession. When she walks into a room, the air changes. She smells of something sharper than lavender, perhaps a mix of expensive French perfume and the metaphorical scent of ambition. She is immaculate. Not a hair is out of place, Her hemlines are mathematically precise, her wit is dry and ready. She arrives in the prince's life through a series of social steps, climbing the ladder of his set, a group of people the old establishment views with deep suspicion. This set enjoys American cocktails, ice cold and strong, rather than warm sherry. They like jazz, they like staying up late. And it is here, at a weekend house party, that the Prince of Wales meets Mrs. Simpson. She is currently married to her second husband, Ernest Simpson, a mild-mannered shipping executive who seems content to be a supporting character in his wife's dazzling play. The initial meeting is innocuous, yet it contains the seed of everything that follows. The legend goes, and it is a story told with varying degrees of accuracy, that the prince asked her a banal question about missing the central heating of America. A standard courtier would have agreed politely. Wallis, however, reportedly replied that she was sorry to disappoint him, but she actually preferred the cold. It was a tiny moment of contradiction. She did not fawn. She did not flatter. She spoke to him as an equal, perhaps even as a superior. To a man who has been surrounded by yes-men since birth, a no is the most intoxicating aphrodisiac in the world. Historians still argue fiercely about the true nature of Wallis's hold over Edward. Was it purely romantic? Was it sexual? Or was it psychological? There is a persistent theory, supported by many biographers, that Edward did not want a wife so much as he wanted a mother. His own upbringing had been cold and distant. He remained, in many ways, a case of arrested development, a Peter Pan terrified of growing up. Wallis, with her organisational skills and her dominance, stepped into that void. She began to manage him. She criticised his clothes. She told him when to go to bed. She plucked the cigar from his mouth when he had smoked too much. Observers at the time were stunned to see the future King of England following her around like a puppy, his eyes wide with adoration, while she treated him with a casual, almost dismissive familiarity. It was a dynamic that horrified the court. It was simply not done to correct a royal in public, but it thrilled Edward. He had found the one person who could make the chaotic world feel ordered, provided he submitted entirely to her will. But there is a shadow side to this allure, one that the intelligence services were already beginning to document in their growing files. Wallis was not just an American socialite. She was a woman with a past, and in 1930s Britain, a woman with a past was a liability. Whispers began to circulate about her time in China during her first marriage. These rumours, likely exaggerated by xenophobia and misogyny, suggested she had learned ancient arts or secrets of seduction in the brothels of Cairo or Shanghai. There was almost certainly no truth to the more salacious details. Historians generally dismiss the infamous China dossier as a fabrication of her enemies, but the fact that such rumours existed shows how dangerous she was perceived to be. She was seen as a sorceress, a siren luring the prince onto the rocks. The establishment couldn't understand why he loved her, so they invented dark, mystical reasons to explain it. They could not accept the simpler, more human truth that he was a lonely, weak man, and she was a strong, interesting woman who made him feel alive. The tragedy of the crisis is often framed as a sudden event, but it was actually a slow-motion capture. The critical moment comes in 1934 when the prince's then-mistress, Lady Thelma Furness, makes a fatal error. Preparing to travel to America for a few months, she turns to her friend Wallis and jokingly asks her to look after the little man while she is away. It is one of history's great ironies, a moment that should be underscored with a minor chord on a cello. Wallis agrees. She looks after him indeed. By the time Lady Furness returns, the locks have been changed, metaphorically speaking. The prince is no longer hers. He is entirely obsessively consumed by Mrs. Simpson. He begins to shower her with jewels, Cartier gems that sparkle with a brilliance that borders on vulgarity. He takes her on holidays. He invites her to the fort. And Ernest Simpson, the husband, is dragged along, the third man in a bizarre triangle that the upper classes politely pretend not to notice. Yet even now, nobody thinks this will end the monarchy. Why? Because kings have always had mistresses. It is a tradition as old as the crown itself. Edward VII had Lily Langtry and Alice Keppel. Charles II had an entire roster. The establishment assumes that Wallis Simpson is just a passing phase, a flavour of the month. They assume that when Edward becomes king, he will do what kings always do. Marry a nice, boring European princess for duty, and keep Wallis in a discreet townhouse in Mayfair for fun. They underestimate two things. First, they underestimate the intensity of Edward's obsession. He does not want a mistress, he wants a soulmate. Second, they underestimate Wallis herself. She's not the type to hide in a townhouse. She enjoys the light. She enjoys the power. And as the old King George V fades in Norfolk and the new King Edward VIII ascends, the stage is set for a collision between the 19th century rules of the game and a 20th century woman who refuses to play by them. The American enigma has arrived, and she has brought with her a storm that will blow the roof off the palace. The love affair is no longer a private hobby. It is about to become a matter of state. And somewhere in the dark, a clerk in the British Intelligence Service opens a fresh file, dips his pen in ink, and writes down the name that will define the decade, Mrs. Simpson. The year is now 1936, the month is May, and the King's obsession with Wallis Simpson is the worst-kept secret in high society. It is the elephant in the ballroom, the ghost at the banquet, the whisper in the opera box. Everyone who matters knows. The duchesses know. The politicians know. The American tourists know. But the British public, the millions of people who buy newspapers, pay taxes, and cheer when the king drives by, know absolutely nothing. This is the Great Silence, a manufactured void that feels almost impossible to imagine in our modern age of 24-hour news cycles and social media leaks. Today, a royal scandal breaks in seconds. In 1936, it was contained by a gentleman's agreement so powerful it defied the laws of information gravity. This silence is the domain of the press barons, the handful of wealthy, powerful men who own the newspapers of Fleet Street. Enter Lord Beaverbrook and Lord Rothermere, the titans of the British press. These men are not merely publishers, they are kingmakers. They dine with prime ministers and play bridge with royalty. They are part of the establishment, and their loyalty, at least for now, is to the institution of the monarchy, not to the curiosity of the public. There is a tacit understanding, a code of honour among thieves, that the king's private life is off limits. It is a protective ring of steel forged from deference and fear. Deference because the king is still seen as semi-divine, a figure above the grubby fray of gossip columns. Fear because to break the story is to invite libel laws, social ostracism, and perhaps even the collapse of the government. So, the editors of the Times, the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Express agree to look the other way. They crop Wallis out of photographs. They delete her name from court circulars. They report on the king's dinners as if he were dining alone, a bachelor monarch dedicated solely to his people. However, the world does not stop at the white cliffs of Dover. While Fleet Street remains silent, the rest of the planet is shouting. In the United States, the King and Mrs. Simpson is the story of the year. American newspapers, unburdened by British deference and delighted by the idea of a Yankee girl capturing the heart of the emperor, run wild. They publish headlines that would make a British butler faint. "King's mole," screams one tabloid. "Wallis and Edward, the love chase," declares another. Cartoons depict Wallis trying on crowns, or the king strumming a banjo while the British lion weeps. Magazines like Time and Liberty run feature stories dissecting every aspect of the relationship. In France, the gossip columns are equally loose-lipped. In Canada and Australia, the whispers are growing into roars. This creates a surreal twilight reality for the British traveller. A businessman flying to New York picks up a paper at the airport and is stunned to read that his king is practically married to a double divorcee. He returns to London, expecting the city to be in flames, only to find the Daily Mail discussing the flower show and the cricket scores. People begin to smuggle foreign magazines into the country like contraband. They cut out clippings and mail them to relatives in the shires. The knowledge spreads underground, a subterranean river of gossip flowing beneath the dry, cracked surface of official silence. It is a dangerous situation. The gap between what the elite knows and what the people know is widening by the day, creating a pressure cooker that is bound to explode. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin watches this with a growing sense of dread. He is a man of the shires, a pipe-smoking, tweed-wearing symbol of stability who hates drama. He knows the silence cannot last. He knows that sooner or later a rogue editor or a slip of the tongue will break the dam. He summons the king for private chats, trying to gently steer him away from the cliff edge, but Edward is deaf to warnings. He believes he can control the press, just as he controls the mood of a party. He personally calls Lord Beaverbrook, asking for favours, asking for silence, using his charm to suppress the truth. It is a stunning abuse of power. The head of state colluding with the media to hide facts from the electorate. But Edward sees it as protecting his privacy. He does not understand that by hiding the truth, he is making the inevitable revelation 10 times worse. He is turning a problem into a shock. There is a specific sensory quality to this silence. It feels heavy, like the humid air before a thunderstorm. In the newsrooms of Fleet Street, reporters are frustrated. They have the story of the century sitting in their notebooks, but they are forbidden to type it. They sit in the smoky pubs of London, the Cheshire Cheese, the Tippler, drinking pints of bitter and trading rumours they cannot print. They know about the duels. They know about the weekends at the fort. They know about the nickname the king has for his ministers. They are sitting on dynamite, and the fuse is burning down, but the order to hold remains absolute. Meanwhile, the king continues to live as if the glass walls of his life are made of stone. He takes Wallis to dinner at the most visible restaurants. He parades her in front of society. He seems to be daring the press to speak, testing the limits of their loyalty. It is a game of chicken played with the reputation of the crown, and in the background a new character enters the scene, or rather re-enters with a vengeance, the spectre of divorce. Ernest Simpson is still in the picture, but barely. The legal machinery is beginning to turn to remove him completely to clear the path for the king. This is the trigger the press is waiting for. A divorce case is a matter of public record. It happens in a court. It involves judges and lawyers and documents. Once the case of Simpson versus Simpson hits the docket, the silence will become legally impossible to maintain. The press barons look at their calendars. They check the court dates. They know the day is coming. The silence of the Fleet Street barons is not peace. It is the deep breath before the scream. And as the summer of 1936 approaches, the king decides to take a holiday, a cruise that will finally shatter the illusions of his solitude and force the world to look at the woman standing on the deck beside him. The grey, muffled silence of London is left behind now, replaced by the blinding white light of the Adriatic sun. It is August 1936, the month when the political world usually sleeps, but this year the Mediterranean is wide awake. We are standing on the teak deck of the Nahlin, a luxury steam yacht chartered by the king for a summer cruise that will become the most documented and disastrous holiday in royal history. The vessel is a masterpiece of white paint and brass, cutting through the turquoise waters off the coast of Dalmatia. To the casual observer, this looks like a paradise. A king and his friends enjoying the freedom of the open sea, far from the red boxes and the stuffy bishops. But to the historian, the Nahlin is not a boat. It is a floating stage where the final act of the tragedy begins to rehearse in plain sight. The air here smells of salt spray, expensive suntan oil, and the heavy sweet smoke of Turkish tobacco. Edward is relaxed, perhaps more relaxed than a monarch has ever been permitted to be. He has shed the uniforms and the morning coats, and he wanders the deck in shorts, shirtless, his chest tanned deep brown, a gold cross on a chain glinting against his skin. Beside him, always, is Wallis. She is impeccable, in high-waisted linen trousers and silk scarves, holding court with a cocktail in hand. They touch constantly, a hand on an arm, a whisper in an ear, an intimacy that is startlingly modern and utterly forbidden for a king who is supposed to be the solitary father of his people. As the yacht drifts from port to port, Dubrovnik, Corfu, Istanbul, it trails a wake of chaos. The secrecy that holds firm in Britain has evaporated here. The world's press has descended like a flock of gulls. American reporters hire speedboats to buzz the Nahlin, their cameras with telephoto lenses snapping furiously across the water. They hire airplanes to swoop low overhead, trying to catch a glimpse of the king and his lady. Every time the yacht docks, thousands of locals crowd the quays. In Yugoslavia, the crowds chant a phrase that echoes off the stone walls of the ancient harbour, Zivila Ljubav, Zivila Ljubav. It translates to long live love. The king, beaming, waves his straw hat, believing the people are cheering for his romance, validating his choice. Historians still argue about this moment. Was the king deluding himself? Did he mistake the curiosity of the mob for a political mandate? Some scholars suggest the crowds were actually cheering for the novelty of the spectacle, or were even planted by local officials to flatter the visiting monarch. But Edward hears what he wants to hear. He sees the smiling faces and thinks, if they accept us, why won't England? He does not understand that a holiday romance in the Balkans is very different from the grim constitutional reality of the Church of England. The images captured during this cruise are explosive. For centuries, the British monarch has been a figure of distant, buttoned-up dignity. Now, suddenly, there are photographs of the King of England rowing a small boat in swimming trunks, looking for all the world like a retired dentist on vacation. There are photos of Wallis shielding her eyes from the sun, looking imperious and claiming the space beside him as if she were already queen. These pictures are splashed across the front pages of newspapers in New York, Paris, and Berlin. The New York Times runs daily updates on the royal romance. The entire world is watching a reality show before the term existed. But in Britain, nothing. The gentleman's agreement holds. The British public sees only sanitised, cropped photos of the king inspecting a naval base or visiting a war memorial. They do not see the woman in the deck chair. They do not see the shirtless king. The disconnect is now total. The empire is effectively living in two parallel dimensions, the one in the foreign press, where the king is a playboy lover, and the one in the British press, where he is a diligent, lonely sovereign. But the silence on the Nahlin is deceptive. While the king sunbathes, the machinery of state is beginning to grind its gears in alarm. On board the yacht, hidden among the guests, are men who are not there for the cocktails. There are detectives. There are actuaries writing frantic letters back to London. They report that the king is careless with security. He leaves sensitive diplomatic papers lying around the cabin. He speaks openly in front of boatmen and waiters who might be spies. The itinerary itself is a headache. The yacht sails dangerously close to politically volatile regions, and there are fears for the king's physical safety. But the deeper fear is moral. The establishment back in London, the bishops, the generals, the courtiers, view the Nahlin cruise not as a holiday, but as a vulgar parade. They see a king who has lost his dignity, and in the unwritten constitution of Britain, dignity is not a luxury. It is the currency of survival. If the king becomes a joke, the monarchy dies. One particular evening on the cruise captures the surreal tension perfectly. The yacht is anchored off the coast of Greece. The water is black and glassy, reflecting the stars. The king and Wallis are dining on deck, laughter drifting over the water. It is a scene of romantic perfection. But just beyond the circle of lamplight, in the shadows of the radio room, a message is coming in from London. It is a warning. The Prime Minister is growing impatient. The silence cannot be held much longer. The American papers are arriving in Britain by the thousands, carried by tourists, and the rumours are leaking into the golf clubs and the tea shops. The spell of the cruise is about to break. Edward, however, ignores the warnings. He is drunk on the freedom of the sea and the adoration of the woman he loves. He believes he is untouchable. He believes that when he returns to London, he can simply command the government to accept his marriage. Just as he commands the Nahlin to change course, he is wrong. The cruise has done damage that cannot be repaired. It has provided the visual evidence that his enemies, and even his friends, needed to prove that he is unfit. The shirtless photos, the carelessness, the public display of obsession, these are not just social faux pas. They are weapons that will be used against him in the coming months. The Sivila Lyubov chants will fade, but the photographs will remain in the files of the Prime Minister and the Archbishop of Canterbury, proof that the king is putting his pleasure before his duty. As the Nahlin turns back toward the west, ending the golden summer, the sun begins to set on Edward's short reign. He steps off the boat in September, tanned, fit, and happy, walking straight into a trap that has been carefully laid while he was watching the waves. The holiday is over. The files are full. And the men in the grey suits are ready to stop whispering and start acting. The camera pulls back from the white yacht as it steams away, leaving only a churning wake that quickly disappears into the dark, indifferent sea. The sun of the Adriatic has faded, and we return to a world of rain-slicked pavement and grey wool. It is October 1936. The camera of our history moves away from the palaces and the yachts, descending into the narrow, fog-choked alleyways of Westminster, down into the basement offices where the air smells of wet umbrellas, stale tea, and typewriter ribbon. This is the domain of the watchers. While the public is still dreaming of a fairy tale romance, the British intelligence services, MI5 and the Special Branch, are compiling a nightmare. The file on the King's desk is about love. The file on the desk of Sir Horace Wilson, a senior government advisor, is about treason. To understand the abdication, one must understand that by the autumn of 1936, the government was not just worried about the King's heart, they were terrified about his mouth. The King of England is the ultimate repository of state secrets. He sees every telegram, every war plan, every confidential memo. He is the human safe of the empire. But the watchers have concluded that the safe has been left unlocked. The focus of their surveillance is Wallis Simpson. She is now the most watched woman in London. Detectives shadow her car as it winds through the city streets. They stand in the rain outside her apartment at Bryanston Court, noting who comes and who goes, their collars turned up against the chill. They tap her telephone lines, listening to the crackling conversations that drift between her and the king. What they hear disturbs them, but what they see disturbs them more. Wallis is not merely a socialite, she is a magnet for the wrong kind of people. The 1930s are a time of intense paranoia. The shadow of Nazi Germany is lengthening across Europe, and in the salons of London there is a dangerous flirtation with fascism. Wallis, with her love of order and her disdain for the stuffy British establishment, finds herself drawn to the sharp modern aesthetic of the new German regime. Enter Joachim von Ribbentrop. He is the German ambassador to London, a man of immense vanity, arrogance, and charm. He is a frequent guest at the parties Wallis attends. The intelligence reports note, with clinical precision, the way he kisses her hand, the way he lingers in conversation. There is a persistent legend, one that historians still debate, with raised eyebrows, that Ribbentrop sent Wallis 17 red carnations every single day. Why 17? The rumour mill suggested it commemorated the number of times they had slept together. It is almost certainly a myth, a piece of dark propaganda designed to paint the potential queen as a loose woman and a German sympathiser. But true or not, the story travels through the government like a virus. The fear is not that Wallis is a trained spy, she is likely too loose-lipped for actual espionage, but that she is a conduit. The king tells her everything. He reads government papers to her while she does her nails. He complains about ministers. He mocks policies. And the intelligence chiefs fear that what is whispered to Wallis at breakfast might be whispered to Ribbentrop at dinner and telegraphed to Berlin by midnight. The surveillance extends to the king himself. This is the most shocking truth of the crisis. The British government is effectively spying on its own monarch. It is a constitutional inversion, a silent coup taking place in the files. Agents report on the king's carelessness. They document instances where red boxes are left open in the back seat of cars or unattended in hallways at the fort. One particularly chilling report details how a visiting German cousin was left alone in a room with top-secret documents while the king went to mix a drink. The establishment realizes they are dealing with a leaky vessel. The king does not understand the gravity of the looming war. He admires Hitler's ability to get things done. He thinks he can prevent conflict through personal charm. To the hardened men of the Foreign Office, this naivety is more dangerous than malice. A king who talks too much is a liability they cannot afford. Then there is the China dossier. This is the darkest corner of the intelligence effort, a smear campaign that reveals the ruthlessness of the establishment. Reports circulate, likely fabricated or wildly exaggerated, about Wallis's time in China during the 1920s. The files are filled with salacious Orientalist fantasies about special techniques she supposedly learned in the lotus dens of the East, techniques that have enslaved the king. It is a brutal, misogynistic weapon used to dehumanize Wallis, to turn her from a woman into a witch. These files are never released to the public, but they are whispered into the ears of the Prime Minister, the bishops, and the Queen Mother. They serve to harden the resolve of the royal family. This is not just a woman with 2 ex-husbands. This is a moral contagion. The king must be saved from her, not just for the sake of the church, but for the sake of his own soul and the security of the realm. The tension in these intelligence offices is palpable. The men reading the transcripts are traditionalists. They believe in God, king, and country. To see the king behaving like a lovesick teenager, compromising the dignity of the crown, is physically painful for them. There is a sense of mourning in the reports, a feeling that the man they swore allegiance to has already left the building. They count the hours, they track the movements, they wait for the divorce decree from Ipswich, which will signal the point of no return. And through it all, the king remains blissfully unaware of the net tightening around him. He believes he is fighting a battle for love against old-fashioned snobbery. He does not realise he is fighting a battle for survival against the combined weight of the British intelligence state. One specific moment in the files captures the absurdity and the danger. A police officer on protection duty at the fort Reports that the king and Wallis were seen chasing each other around the garden, spraying each other with a garden hose, shrieking with laughter. To a modern eye, it is a human moment, two people in love, playing. To the grim-faced men in Whitehall reading the report, it is the final straw. It is undignified. It is childish. It is proof that the king is not a serious man. And in 1936, with the storm clouds of World War II gathering on the horizon, a serious man is exactly what the empire needs. The file is closed. The ribbon is tied. The evidence is overwhelming. The king is a security risk. The narrative has shifted from unsuitable marriage to national danger. And now, the file must be carried upstairs, out of the shadows, and placed on the desk of the only man who can do something about it. The Prime Minister. The secrets are no longer safe. The ghosts in the machine are ready to speak. This segment reveals how power quietly migrates when trust collapses. The crown remains visible, glittering, adored, but authority seeps downward into filing cabinets, surveillance logs, and unsigned memoranda. It is not a revolution in the streets, it is a transfer conducted in whispers. When intelligence services begin watching their own monarch, sovereignty has already shifted, even if no one dares say it aloud. There is a gentle parallel here with the late Roman Republic, when generals were still saluted, but real decisions were increasingly made by clerks, informers, and private networks of loyalty. The figure at the top remained sacred. The system beneath adapted to survive him. Edward's tragedy is that he never notices the adaptation. Why this matters is that states can forgive moral scandal, but they rarely forgive unpredictability. A king in love is tolerable. A king who talks freely, leaves papers open, and believes charm can replace caution becomes dangerous in a world moving toward mechanized war. Some historians argue the intelligence fears were exaggerated, shaped by class prejudice and misogyny more than real evidence. That too may be true. Yet perception itself becomes reality. Once the guardians of the state decide the lock is broken, the question is no longer whether secrets have escaped, only whether the safe can be replaced in time. The scene shifts now from the shadowed basements of intelligence to the high vaulted ceilings of spiritual power. We cross the River Thames, the black water churning silently under the London fog, to arrive at Lambeth Palace, the ancient fortress of the Archbishop of Canterbury. It is November 1936 and the air here is different. It does not smell of tobacco or engine oil. It smells of beeswax, old parchment, and the cold, stony breath of centuries. If the intelligence agents were the eyes of the establishment, then Cosmo Gordon Lang, the Archbishop of Canterbury, is its conscience, and perhaps its executioner. Lang is a figure straight out of a medieval drama, tall, gaunt, with a face that seems carved from marble and a voice that can drop to a whisper or fill a cathedral. He is 72 years old, a man of immense intellect and even greater vanity, who tends to view himself as the personal vicar of the Almighty. Historians have long debated the true nature of Cosmo Lang. To some, he was a saintly defender of the faith, the only man brave enough to uphold moral standards in a decaying world. To others, he was a theatrical schemer, a prelate who enjoyed the company of duchesses a little too much, and who viewed the king's modernisation not just as a mistake, but as a personal insult to his own dignity. Whatever the truth, in the autumn of 1936, he is the most dangerous man in England for Edward VIII. The crisis that brings Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin to the gates of Lambeth Palace is not political, it is theological. And it is a problem that Edward, with his modern mind, simply cannot grasp. To the king, his marriage is a private joy. To the church, it is a metaphysical impossibility. The King of England holds the title Defender of the Faith and Supreme Governor of the Church of England. He is the head of the institution, yet the Church of England in 1936 has a clear, unbreakable rule. Marriage is indissoluble. It does not recognise divorce. It certainly does not permit the remarriage of a divorced person whose former spouse is still living. Wallis Simpson has 2 living ex-husbands, or soon will have. For the king to marry her would be akin to the Pope marrying a movie star. It would break the internal logic of the entire system. It would create a schism where the head of the church is living in what the church defines as open sin. Imagine the meeting between these 2 guardians of tradition. Baldwin, the heavy rumpled politician, looking like a tired bear in a tweed suit, sitting opposite Lang, who sits erect in his purple cassock, his hands steepled in contemplation. They're an odd couple, the pragmatist and the priest, but they are united by a terrifying deadline, the coronation, scheduled for May 1937. The coronation is not merely a party with a golden hat, it is a religious sacrament. It is a holy rite in which the monarch is anointed with sacred oil, blessed by God, and swears a solemn oath to uphold the laws of the church. Lang is physically nauseated by the idea of performing this ceremony for a man who plans to marry a double divorcee. He cannot, in good conscience, anoint Edward if Wallis is waiting in the wings. It would be, in his eyes, a blasphemy. He confides in his diary, a document of immense historical value, that the thought of the king's behaviour haunts his prayers. He sees Edward not just as a wayward son, but as a spiritual contagion that must be contained before he infects the sacred mystique of the monarchy. The conversation in the library of Lambeth Palace is quiet, civil, and devastating. There is no shouting. The walls are too thick for that. Baldwin lays out the political reality. The Dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa, will not accept Wallis as Queen. The cabinet will not accept her. The people, if they knew, would be divided. Lang adds the spiritual reality. The church will not conduct the marriage. If the king proceeds, he will have to be married by a civil registrar, like a common citizen, or find a rogue priest willing to defy the hierarchy. For a king who is supposed to be God's anointed, a civil wedding is a humiliation. It strips away the divine right and leaves only a man in a suit signing a register. The 2 men come to a silent agreement. The king's matter, as they call it, cannot be solved by compromise. The king believes he can have it all: the throne, the church, and the woman. Baldwin and Lang know that he must choose. And they're beginning to suspect, with a mixture of sorrow and relief, that he will choose the woman. There is a subtle irony here that often escapes a quick glance at history. Edward VIII was not an atheist. He was a man of his time, spiritual but not religious, bored by liturgy but moved by sentiment. He genuinely believed that God wouldn't mind if he was happy. He thought the church's rules were dusty relics that could be swept away by the force of his love. He underestimated the structural rigidity of the institution he led. He viewed the archbishop as a tedious old man in a dress. He did not see him as the guardian of the exit door. Lang, for his part, viewed Edward as a tragic figure, a man possessed by a demon of lust. In the quiet of the palace, Lang prepares his strategy. He will not publicly attack the king. That would be vulgar. Instead, he will simply stand still. He will be the immovable object against which the irresistible force of the king's desire will shatter. He signals to Baldwin that if the government stands firm, the church will support them. The alliance is sealed. The cross and the sword are now locked together against the crown. The atmosphere in the room is heavy with the weight of what they are doing. They are effectively plotting the removal of a king who has not yet broken a law, only a convention. It is a constitutional surgery performed without anaesthetic. Baldwin packs his pipe. the familiar comfort of tobacco settling his nerves. He knows he has the harder job. He has to go back to the king and deliver the news that the church is closed to him. Lang remains in his library, perhaps looking out at the foggy river, feeling the burden of his office. He is saving the monarchy by destroying the monarch. It is a paradox that sits uncomfortably on his shoulders. He wonders if history will judge him as a saviour or a Pharisee. As the meeting ends, the bells of a nearby church begin to toll, their sound muffled by the damp air. They are marking the hour, but they sound like a funeral dirge for the reign of Edward the Fagged. The two most powerful pillars of the British establishment have held firm. The king is now alone. He has the love of Mrs. Simpson, but he has lost the blessing of God and the confidence of the state. The trap is closed, not with a snap, but with the soft final thud of a heavy church door shutting out the light. The fog of November thickens, swirling around the gas lamps of London like a living thing, obscuring the edges of the city, just as the king tries to obscure the hard edges of the Constitution. We find Edward now in a state of frantic improvisation. The intelligence files have damned him. The church has closed its doors. But the king has one final card to play, a desperate legal manoeuvre pulled from the dusty history books of European royalty. It is a concept that sounds strange to modern ears, a word that clatters on the tongue like a dropped spoon, morganatic. To understand the king's last stand, we must understand this term. In the rigid hierarchies of the German and Austrian courts where Edward's ancestors originated, a morganatic marriage, sometimes called a marriage of the left hand, was a compromise. It allowed a prince to marry a woman of lower rank. She would be his lawful wife, but she would not take his titles. She would not be queen. And crucially, any children born of the union would not inherit the throne. They would be commoners, erased from the line of succession before they were even born. To Edward, this idea, suggested to him by Esmond Harmsworth, a newspaper magnate and friend, shines like a lighthouse in the storm. It seems the perfect solution. It satisfies his heart because he gets to marry Wallis. It satisfies the government, or so he thinks, because Wallis will not be queen and will not inject her unsuitable bloodline into the monarchy. He grasps this idea with the enthusiasm of a drowning man reaching for a piece of driftwood. He imagines a future where he can remain king, beloved by his people, while Wallis lives beside him as the Duchess of Cornwall, a private wife for a public man. It is a romantic delusion of the highest order. He views the British Constitution as a flexible arrangement, a gentleman's agreement that can be tweaked between friends over a brandy. He is about to discover that it is actually a cage of iron bars. The camera shifts to 10 Downing Street. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, listens to the King's proposal with a heavy hooded expression. He does not reject it immediately. He is too shrewd a politician for that. Instead, he tells the King he will consult. This is the deadliest weapon in the bureaucratic arsenal. To consult means to widen the circle, to bring in more voices, to ensure that the rejection, when it comes, is not the opinion of one man, but the thunderous verdict of the entire empire. Baldwin sends telegrams to the prime ministers of the dominions, to Canada, to Australia, to New Zealand, to South Africa. He asks them a simple question: would they accept a morganatic marriage for the king? The answers that come back via the undersea cables are swift and brutal. They are not merely no, they are outraged. In 1936, the British Empire is not just a map painted pink, it is a moral construct. The Dominions view the crown as the holy link that binds them together. Joseph Lyons, the Prime Minister of Australia, is particularly horrified. His Catholic population would revolt at the idea of a divorced woman anywhere near the throne, regardless of her title. Canada is equally cold South Africa is dismissive. The verdict is unanimous. A king cannot have a part-time wife. A queen is not just a spouse, she is a job description. To split the role is to break the mystique. Back in London, the cabinet meets to formalise the rejection. This is a room of hard men. Neville Chamberlain is there, sharp and exacting, already eyeing the Prime Minister's chair. They look at the morganatic proposal and see a constitutional nightmare. If the king marries morganatically, it requires a special act of Parliament to make it legal. It would require the Labour opposition to agree. It would require every Dominion Parliament to pass its own law. It would turn the king's marriage into a messy, public political debate that could drag on for months. And what if Wallis died and he married again? What if they had children and the king wanted to change the rules later? It opens a Pandora's box of what-ifs. The cabinet slams the lid shut. They are not interested in solving the king's problem. They are interested in protecting the system. Baldwin returns to the king with the answer. The scene is intimate, almost tragic in its quietness. There is no shouting match. Baldwin simply explains that the morganatic option is dead. The government will not introduce the legislation. The Dominions will not support it. The door is locked. He then presents the king with the three choices. A moment of clarity that cuts through the fog like a searchlight. "Sir," he says, in his slow rumble of a voice, "you have three paths. 1, you give up the marriage and stay king. 2, you marry contrary to the advice of your ministers. The government resigns, and you cause a constitutional crisis that will likely destroy the monarchy. 3, you abdicate." Edward looks at the old man. He realises, perhaps for the first time, that the game is rigged. The government resigns option is a bluff he cannot call. If Baldwin resigns, no other politician will form a government. The king would be left ruling alone, a dictator in a democracy, leading to an immediate election fought on the issue of his marriage, a king's party versus the establishment. It would tear the country apart. It would be the end of the Windsors. Edward is reckless, yes, but he is not a revolutionary. He recoils from the idea of dragging the crown into the gutter of partisan politics. That leaves only two real choices, Wallis or the throne. The middle way of the morganatic marriage was a mirage, shimmering in the heat of his desperation, but vanishing as soon as he touched it. Historians still argue whether Baldwin manoeuvred the king into this corner on purpose. Did he present the morganatic marriage to the cabinet in a way that ensured its rejection? Did he exaggerate the opposition of the Dominions? There is a school of thought that suggests Baldwin wanted Edward gone, that he saw the king as a liability and used the marriage as a convenient lever to eject him. They argue that a more creative politician, a Winston Churchill perhaps, might have found a way to make it work. But Baldwin was not looking for a way. He was looking for safety. He wanted a boring king for a dangerous world. And Edward was too bright, too loud, too unpredictable. The rejection of the morganatic marriage is the psychological turning point. Until this moment, Edward believed he could win. He believed his popularity would save him. Now, he sees the walls of the trap. He retreats to Fort Belvedere, his white castle in the trees, and the atmosphere changes from anxiety to doom. The servants move quietly, sensing the shift. The king stops reading the few papers he still receives. He spends hours on the telephone to Wallis, his voice rising in panic. He is a man who has been told no for the first time in his life, on the one subject that matters most. The files of the government have done their work. The legal arguments have suffocated the romance. The fairy tale is over. The tragedy has begun. And outside the gates of the fort, the press barons are checking their watches. The silence has held for months, but the pressure is now too great. The story is about to break, And when it does, the king will not be a hero fighting for love. He will be a man who tried to rewrite the Constitution and failed. The mirage has faded, leaving only the cold, hard desert of reality. The geography of the crisis now contracts to a single point on the map, a strange and lonely folly hidden within the deep woods of Windsor Great Park. This is Fort Belvedere. To understand the end of the reign, you must visualise this house. It is not a palace in the traditional sense, nor is it a fortress capable of withstanding an army. It is a toy castle, built in the 18th century as a summer retreat, a place of faux Gothic turrets and triangular windows that looks less like a seat of power and more like a stage set for a romantic opera. Edward loved it more than any other place on earth. He had spent years renovating it, installing modern bathrooms, planting rhododendrons with his own hands, and creating a sanctuary where he could pretend to be a private gentleman. But in the first days of December 1936, the fort transforms. It ceases to be a home and becomes a bunker. The winter fog rolls in off the Thames Valley, wrapping the castle in a suffocating blanket of white, cutting it off from the world. Inside, the mood is frantic, claustrophobic, and surreal. The King of England is effectively under siege, not by soldiers, but by silence, telegrams, and the ringing of the telephone. The camera moves through the hexagonal central hall, where the king paces back and forth, a cigarette always burning in his hand. The air is thick with smoke and the scent of expensive leather. The staff, loyal, terrified, and discreet, move like ghosts, bringing trays of tea and cocktails that go largely untouched. Edward is isolated. The government ministers have stopped coming. The courtiers have retreated to London to await orders. He is left with a small circle of friends, a shadow court that shrinks by the hour. Among them is Winston Churchill, the old lion, who, unlike the rest of the establishment, refuses to abandon his king. Churchill drives down from London, his presence filling the room with a sudden burst of energy and history. He urges the king to fight. He speaks of a king's party, a romantic idea that the monarch could appeal directly to the people over the heads of the politicians. He quotes Shakespeare. He invokes the spirit of ancestors. For a moment, the king's eyes light up. He imagines himself standing on the ramparts, defying the grey men in suits. But this is where the myth collides with the cold reality of the files. Historians still debate Churchill's intervention. Was it a noble act of loyalty, or a disastrous miscalculation that only hastened the end? The truth is likely the latter. The government spies are watching. They know Churchill is there, and to Baldwin and the cabinet, Churchill's presence confirms their worst fear, that Edward might try to destabilise the government to save his own skin. The King's Party is not seen as a political movement, but as a constitutional insurrection. The wires hum with panic. The establishment tightens the noose. They let it be known that if the king fights, they will not just defeat him, they will destroy him. They will release the files. They will unleash the China dossier. They will make the private scandal public in the most humiliating way possible. The king, sensing this invisible threat, wavers. He knows that a fight would tear the country apart, and for all his flaws, he is a patriot. He does not want to be the king who broke the empire. Wallis is there too, but the dynamic between them has shifted. The laughter of the Nahlin cruise is gone. She is no longer the confident American orchestrating the room. She is a woman who realizes she has walked into a trap. She is frightened. She sees the toll the pressure is taking on Edward, his shaking hands, his manic bursts of speech, his long silences. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, but emotionally resonant, that she tries to leave. She urges him to let her go, to stay king, to find another way. But Edward is beyond reason. His obsession has calcified into a desperate need. He tells her that if she leaves, he will follow her. He threatens suicide. It is a terrifying form of love, heavy and suffocating. She is not just his fiancée. She is his hostage, and he is hers. They are locked together in the toy castle, watching the rain lash against the windows, waiting for the inevitable. The isolation is compounded by the silence of the wires. The king tries to call Baldwin, tries to call his brothers, but he finds the conversations short, formal, and cold. He realizes that the machinery of state is now working around him, not for him. He is the captain of the ship, but the crew has cut the connection to the bridge. They are steering the vessel from the engine room, and they are steering it away from him. Outside, in the gardens he loves, the rhododendrons are dripping with winter damp. He used to spend hours here, hacking away at the undergrowth, sweating in an old sweater, finding peace in the physical labour. Now, he cannot go outside without feeling the eyes of the protection officers, men who were there to guard him, but who now feel like jailers. Every car that comes up the long gravel drive is scrutinised. Is it a messenger? Is it a friend? Is it the end? There is a bizarre, darkly humorous detail that survives in the memoirs of the staff. Amidst the collapse of his reign, the king remains obsessed with domestic trivia. He worries about the temperature of the rooms. He fusses over the placement of furniture. It is a common psychological defense. When the big world is uncontrollable, we try to control the small world. He checks the bar to make sure the ice buckets are full, as if a well-made drink can stop the constitutional crisis. He plays the bagpipes, the mournful drone echoing through the turreted rooms, a sound that must have chilled the blood of the waiting staff. It is the sound of a man trying to drown out the silence, but the silence is about to break. The press barons, who have held the dam for so long, can hold it no more. The Bishop of Bradford, a man named Dr. Blunt, a name almost too perfect for a bludgeoning instrument, gives a speech at a diocesan conference. He remarks somewhat vaguely that the king needs God's grace and that he hopes the monarch is aware of his need for it. It is a mild criticism intended for a clerical audience, but in the overheated atmosphere of Fleet Street, it is the spark that ignites the powder keg. The editors in London seize upon it. The bishop criticises the king. It is the excuse they need. The gentleman's agreement is dissolved. The presses begin to roll. The ink is wet on the pages that will tell the British people the truth for the first time. Inside the fort, the telephone rings. It is the news from London. The story is out. The king hangs up the receiver and looks at Wallis. The sanctuary is breached. The private world of Fort Belvedere is no longer private. The fog outside is lifting, not to reveal the sun, but to reveal a landscape of judgment. The king realizes that he has run out of time, out of friends, and out of options. The fortress has fallen without a shot being fired. He is no longer protecting a romance. He is waiting for the terms of his surrender. The camera pulls back from the lighted windows of the fort, leaving it glowing like a lantern in the dark forest, a small, fragile beacon of defiance that is about to be extinguished by the cold wind of history. The silence breaks not with a whisper, but with the roar of printing presses. It is the morning of December 3rd, 1936, a Thursday that dawns cold and damp, the sky over London the colour of a bruised plum. For months, the British public has been living in a curated reality, shielded from the truth by the gentleman's agreement between the king and the press barons, but the Bishop of Bradford has inadvertently kicked the door open, and now the floodwaters are rushing in. The trucks leave the depots of Fleet Street before dawn, their tyres hissing on the wet tarmac, carrying bundles of papers that weigh as heavy as lead. As the city wakes up, the newsboys take their positions on the corners, their breath pluming in the chill air. They do not need to shout today. The placards they lean against the lamppost do the screaming for them. Grave constitutional crisis, warns the News Chronicle. The King's marriage, declares the Times, abandoning its usual reserve for a column of thunderous disapproval. For the average citizen, the clerk on the omnibus, the shopkeeper rolling up his awning, the nurse ending her shift, the world is turned upside down overnight. They went to bed with a bachelor king who was the envy of the world. They wake up to find a man on the brink of disaster, entangled with a woman whose name most of them are reading for the very first time. The shock is physical. In tea shops and railway carriages, total strangers turn to one another, paper in hand, asking if it can possibly be true. The photographs of Wallis Simpson, previously cropped out or suppressed, now stare back at the British people. They study her face, searching for the answer to the riddle. Is she a beauty? Is she a sorceress? Is she, as the cruelest whispers suggest, a spy? The reaction is not a uniform wave of anger. It is a chaotic mix of bewilderment and loyalty. In the working-class districts where Edward is still worshipped as the hero of the Great War and the friend of the unemployed, there is a surge of support. "Let him marry who he wants," cries a voice from the back of a pub. "He's a man, ain't he?" Banners appear outside Buckingham Palace painted on bedsheets, "Hands off our king." The people see a romance. They see a king fighting for his happiness against the stuffy old men in top hats. They do not see the constitutional wreckage. They do not know about the intelligence files, the security risks, or the church's ultimatum. They only know that our Dave is in trouble, and their instinct is to protect him. But inside the government, the mood is one of terrifying clarity. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin watches the public reaction with a hawk's eye. He knows that popularity is volatile. Today they cheer the king. Tomorrow, if they realised the true cost, the resignation of the government, a potential election, a crisis that could shatter the unity of the empire, they would turn. The press, now unleashed, begins to shape the narrative with ruthless efficiency. The editorials shift from shock to stern lectures on duty. They remind the king that the crown is not a personal possession to be enjoyed, but a sacred trust to be served. The message is subtle but firm. You can have the throne, or you can have the woman. You cannot have both. The king's party, the romantic idea of a populist monarch ruling through the love of his people, is being dismantled column inch by column inch. At Fort Belvedere, the atmosphere has shifted from a siege to a scramble. The breaking of the silence has made the toy castle indefensible. The paparazzi, a new and aggressive breed of hunter, are swarming the perimeter. They are climbing trees in Windsor Great Park with telephoto lenses. They are bribing delivery boys. They are practically besieging the gates. The king realises that Wallis can no longer stay there. She is the target. If she remains, she will be hounded, perhaps even attacked, by those who view her as the villain of the piece. A decision is made. She must flee the country. It is a scene straight out of a noir thriller. The plan is hasty, chaotic, and desperate. Lord Brownlow, a loyal lord-in-waiting, is tasked with the mission. Get her to France, and do not let the press catch her. The escape begins in the late afternoon, as the winter light fails. A discreet sedan glides out of the fort's gates, Wallis huddled in the back, face hidden. They drive south toward the coast, toward the ferry at New Haven. It is a nightmare journey. Every pair of headlights in the rearview mirror looks like a reporter's car. Wallis is terrified, clutching a small bag of jewels and papers, leaving behind the man she loves, not knowing if she will ever see him again as king. At the ferry terminal, the disguise is flimsy. A woman of her distinct style is hard to hide. The porters recognize her. The whispers start immediately. That's her. That's the woman. But Brownlow manages to get her on board into a private cabin. As the ship pulls away from the English coast, churning into the dark waters of the Channel, Wallis Simpson leaves Britain. She leaves behind a nation in uproar and a king who is now completely, utterly alone. The telephone lines between the fort and the government are burning hot. The king is pacing the hexagon room, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. With Wallis gone, his resolve does not harden, it fractures. He is not a man who functions well in solitude. He calls her hotel in France the moment she arrives, the connection crackling and faint. He is desperate for reassurance. He ignores the ministers waiting in the anteroom. He ignores the pile of telegrams from the Dominions, all shouting no. He is focused entirely on the empty space where she used to be. Historians often point to this moment, Wallis's flight, as the true end of the reign. As long as she was in the room, he could imagine a fight. With her gone, he is just a lonely man in a big house, being bullied by his own government. Meanwhile, in London, the silence has been replaced by a cacophony of judgment. The establishment closes ranks. The church, the Times, the cabinet, the opposition, they all sing from the same hymn sheet now. The narrative is set. The king is erratic, the woman is unsuitable, and the institution must be saved. There is a specific poignant moment that occurs in cinemas across the country that night. It is customary for the newsreels to end with an image of the king and the playing of the national anthem. In the darkness of the movie palaces, when Edward's face appears on the screen, there is a strange reaction. Some people cheer, some boo, but mostly there is an uncomfortable shifting silence. The anthem plays, God save the king, but the words suddenly feel like a question rather than a prayer. The magical bond between monarch and subject, a bond based on mystery and stability, has been snapped. The king is no longer a symbol, he is a problem. As the weekend approaches, the pressure reaches a boiling point. The king makes a sudden, frantic request to broadcast to the nation. He wants to speak directly to his people on the radio, to explain himself, to tell them about his quest for happiness. He believes that if they just hear his voice, the golden voice that charmed the empire, they will understand. He drafts a speech. It is emotional, raw, and defiant. He sends it to Downing Street for approval. Baldwin reads it and shakes his head. It is unconstitutional. A king cannot appeal to the people against the advice of his ministers. He forbids the broadcast. It is the final checkmate. The king is silenced. He cannot marry. He cannot speak. He cannot stay. The realization settles over Fort Belvedere like the winter fog. The fight is over. The only thing left now is the surrender. The headlines the next morning will not ask what will he do. They will ask when will he go. The breaking of the silence has not saved him. It has exposed the impossibility of his existence. The King of England is naked before his subjects, and the sight is too painful for the country to bear. The storm of headlines and public shouting fades now, replaced by a silence that is absolute and terrifying. It is the morning of December 10th, 1936. We are back inside the octagon room at Fort Belvedere, but the air has changed. It no longer smells of panic or desperate improvisation. It smells of inevitability. The furniture has been pushed back, the curtains drawn against the grey winter light, and in the centre of the room sits a Louis XV desk. On that desk lies a single sheet of paper. It is not a long document, barely a paragraph of text, but it weighs more than the stone blocks of Windsor Castle. This is the instrument of abdication. It is a piece of paper that will sever a line of succession stretching back 1,000 years, a legal blade designed to cut the head off the monarchy without killing the body. The room is filled with men, yet it feels empty, hollowed out by the magnitude of what is about to happen. The cast of characters for this final act has gathered. There are the lawyers, led by Sir Walter Monckton, the King's loyal legal adviser, a man whose face is etched with the exhaustion of the last few weeks. He has drafted this text, redrafted it, and checked it against every constitutional loophole, ensuring that when the King leaves, the door is locked tight behind him. And then there are the brothers. They arrive in a procession of black cars, looking less like princes and more like mourners at a funeral. There is Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, and Prince George, Duke of Kent. And there is Albert, the Duke of York. Bertie. Of all the men in the room, Bertie is the one who looks as if he is about to collapse. He is pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of nausea and disbelief. He sits in a corner, wringing his hands, watching his older brother with a look of sheer horror. To Edward, this piece of paper is an escape hatch. To Bertie, it is a death sentence. He knows that the moment the pen touches that paper, the crushing weight of the crown, the duty, the speeches, the endless scrutiny, will transfer instantly from Edward's shoulders to his own. Edward himself is calm. It is a strange, manic calm, the relief of a man who has finally stopped fighting the current and decided to let the river take him. He moves around the room with a lightness that unsettles the others. He checks the pens. He adjusts his tie. He seems almost cheerful. Like a schoolboy on the last day of term, he has made his choice. The 3 choices of Baldwin have been whittled down to one. He has chosen Wallis, and in doing so, he has convinced himself that he is doing a noble thing, a modern thing. He does not see the betrayal in his brother's eyes. He sees only the freedom on the horizon. The clock on the mantelpiece ticks. It is time. Edward sits at the desk. He picks up the pen. It is a mundane action, one he has performed thousands of times, signing state papers, signing laws, signing letters. But this signature is different. He writes Edward R.I. for the final time in a constitutional capacity. Rex Imperator, King and Emperor. The scratch of the nib against the parchment is loud in the silent room. It is a sound that shreds history. With that ink, he dissolves his oath. He releases his subjects from their allegiance. He steps down from the highest pedestal on earth to become, legally speaking, a nobody. He passes the paper to his brothers. They must witness the act. One by one, they sign. Bertie's hand shakes. The signature of the new king, though he is not yet proclaimed, is tremulous, a physical record of his fear. The witnesses add their names. The document is complete. The atmosphere in the room following the signing is one of profound awkwardness. What do you say to a king who has just fired himself? There is no protocol for this. The courtiers bow, but the bows are stiff, uncertain. Do they bow to Edward, or do they bow to Bertie? The centre of gravity has shifted, and everyone is struggling to keep their balance. Edward, however, breaks the tension with a behaviour that historians still analyse with bafflement. He begins to talk about the future, about money, about titles. He seems to think that he can now retire to a private life of luxury, perhaps returning to England occasionally to offer advice. He does not understand the finality of the door he has just closed. He does not realise that by signing that paper, he has not just resigned a job, he has become an exile. The establishment does not keep former kings around like spare parts. Sir Walter Monckton gathers the document. It must be driven to London immediately to be presented to Parliament. It is the physical proof of the king's departure. As Monckton prepares to leave, he looks at Edward. He sees a man who is legally still king. The abdication does not technically take effect until Parliament passes the Act the next day, but who is spiritually already gone. The spell of majesty has broken. The divine right has evaporated, leaving only a small stylish man in a suit who looks eager to catch a train. But the most heartbreaking moment of the day belongs to Bertie. After the signing, the brothers embrace. It is reported that Edward smiles, perhaps clapping Bertie on the shoulder, wishing him luck, but Bertie breaks down. He weeps openly. It is not tears of joy for his brother's freedom. It is tears of grief for his own life. He writes later that he felt like a lamb being led to the slaughter. He knows he is not trained for this. He stammers. He is shy. He hates the spotlight. And now, because of his brother's obsession, he is being forced onto the throne of the British Empire at its most dangerous moment. The abdication is often framed as Edward's tragedy, but in this room, on this day, the true tragedy is Bertie's. He is the collateral damage of a love story. As the cars pull away from Fort Belvedere, carrying the brothers back to their respective destinies, the fort itself seems to exhale. The energy has drained out of it. The king's party is dead. The king's matter is settled. The files in the intelligence offices can be closed, or at least filed away. The threat has been neutralised. Edward VIII is effectively history. The 325-day reign, the shortest in centuries, is over in all but name. The paper is on its way to Westminster, where the politicians will nod solemnly and pass the legislation that turns the unthinkable into the law of the land. But there is one final piece of business. The public still needs to be told. The rumours have been confirmed by the Act, but the voice, the famous voice, has not yet spoken. The radio microphones are waiting in a tower at Windsor Castle. The script is being polished. The world is tuning in. The signing was the legal death of the king. The broadcast will be his funeral oration. Edward prepares to leave the fort for the last time as its master. He packs his bags. He says goodbye to the servants, many of whom are crying. He walks out into the cold December air, a man who has traded an empire for a woman, convinced he has made the bargain of the century. The camera lingers on the empty desk, the ink still fresh on the blotter, the ghost of a signature hanging in the air. The king is dead. Long live the king. This moment reveals a quiet truth about power. It does not vanish in a dramatic crash. It transfers silently, often unwillingly. Edward experiences abdication as release, almost as relief. Bertie experiences it as inheritance of fear. The same signature delivers freedom to one man and lifelong burden to another. History often remembers the choice maker, but it is shaped just as deeply by the one who never chose at all. There is a soft parallel here with ancient Rome, when reluctant men, like Tiberius, inherited supreme power not through ambition, but through exhaustion of alternatives. In both cases, the state selects stability over desire. The individual becomes secondary to continuity. Bertie's tears echo across centuries of reluctant rulers who did not seek greatness, but were consumed by it. Why this matters is that modern leadership myths focus on bold decisions. This scene reminds us that history often turns on quiet coercion, on moments when saying no is no longer possible. Some historians still argue Edward's abdication was an act of integrity, even courage. Perhaps it was. But integrity has consequences, and courage can cast long shadows. In that room, beneath drawn curtains and ticking clocks, love ends one reign, but duty begins another, far heavier and far less forgiving. The ink on the instrument of abdication is dry, but the emotional contract with the British people remains unsigned. To seal it, or perhaps to sever it completely, requires a voice. We move now to the night of December 11th, 1936. The scene is not a palace balcony or a parliamentary chamber, but a small cluttered office in the Augusta Tower of Windsor Castle. It is a room usually reserved for estate managers, smelling of floor polish and old filing cabinets, but tonight it is the centre of the world. Cables snake across the floor, connecting a single microphone to the transmitters of the BBC, and from there to the furthest reaches of the Empire. The atmosphere is tense, almost suffocatingly so. Sir John Reith, the Director General of the BBC, is present. Reith is a man of granite morality, a dour Scot who views the King's actions not as a tragedy, but as a dereliction of duty. He has personally overseen the technical arrangements, and he has made a decision that historians still note with a shiver of cold formality. When he introduces the speaker to the waiting millions, he does not say His Majesty the King. That title has legally evaporated with the royal assent given to the Abdication Act earlier that day, nor does he say the Duke of Windsor, for that title has not yet been officially created. He introduces him simply, starkly, as His Royal Highness Prince Edward. It is a demotion delivered live on air, a verbal stripping of rank before the first word is even spoken. Edward sits at the desk. He looks tired, his face pale against the dark wood, but his eyes are clear. He holds a script in his hand, a piece of paper that has been polished and refined by none other than Winston Churchill. The old statesman, crying as he read the draft, added the Shakespearean rhythm, the rolling cadences that turn a resignation into a requiem. Edward leans forward. The red light hits. And then, the voice. It is a voice the world knows intimately, high-pitched, clipped, with that strange transatlantic prince's English accent that sounds like glass clinking against crystal. At long last, he begins, I am able to say a few words of my own. Imagine the scene across the globe. In the coal-smoked terraced houses of Yorkshire, families sit in silence around the Wallis, the tea growing cold in the pot. In the drawing rooms of Mayfair, women in evening gowns lean in, handkerchiefs ready. In the mess halls of battleships in the Pacific, sailors stare at the loudspeakers. It is a moment of collective hypnosis. For months, the people have heard about him from ministers and bishops. Now, the ghost speaks, and what he says is a masterpiece of emotional engineering. He does not speak of the Constitution, or the Church, or the advice of ministers. He speaks of the human heart. He delivers the line that will be engraved on his tombstone in the popular imagination, the line that will define the romantic myth for a century. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. It is a devastatingly effective sentence. In 35 words, he reframes the entire crisis. He is not a man fleeing duty. He is a man crushed by the weight of it, a man who is simply too human, too loving, to survive in the cold air of the throne. He mentions his brother, the new king, George VI, with generous praise. He claims he has made this decision for the good of the country. He sounds noble. He sounds tragic. He sounds like the hero of a novel who sacrifices himself for the greater good. But the files, the silent paper witnesses we have been tracking, tell a different story. The speech is a lie. Not a lie of commission, but a lie of omission. He does not mention that he refused every compromise. He does not mention that he stopped reading his state papers months ago. He does not mention that the government viewed him as a security risk. He paints a picture of a man forced out by the sheer weight of the crown, when in reality the establishment is holding the door open for him, relieved to see him go. The speech is a magic trick. It directs the audience's attention to the shiny object, the romance, while the sleight of hand removes the political failure from view. Historians still argue about the morality of this broadcast. Was it a necessary balm to heal the nation, a way to let the king go with dignity? Or was it a final act of vanity, a way for Edward to ensure he remained the star of the show even as he left the stage? As he finishes the broadcast, God bless you all. God save the king. The silence in the room at Windsor is absolute. He pushes the chair back. It is done. He stands up, and for a moment nobody moves. Then the awkwardness of the new reality descends. He is no longer their master. He is just a relation, a guest in his own former castle. He says his goodbyes to his family. The parting is stiff, English, and heartbreaking. He bows to the new king, his brother Bertie. It is the first time he has done so. The gesture is shocking in its finality. It is the physical manifestation of the world turning upside down. Bertie, red-eyed and trembling, can barely speak. The Queen Mother, implacable, furious, and protective of her husband, watches with eyes like flint. She will never forgive Edward, not for the abdication itself, but for what it has done to Bertie. She believes, with a prescience that is almost supernatural, that this burden will kill him. Edward leaves the castle. He does not look back. He steps into a waiting car, which drives him into the night. The destination is Portsmouth, where a Royal Navy destroyer, HMS Fury, is waiting to take him into exile. The name of the ship is an irony that likely escapes him in the moment, but it feels scripted by a dramatist with a dark sense of humour. The Fury will carry him away from the anger of the establishment and the sorrow of the people. The drive to the coast is lonely. The fog has returned, swirling in the headlights, erasing the English countryside as he passes through it. He is travelling toward Wallis, toward France, toward the freedom he has fought so hard to win. But he is also travelling into a void. On the docks at Portsmouth, the scene is ghostly. There are no crowds, no cheering, no flags, just the cold slap of water against the hull and the metallic clanking of the gangway. He boards the ship. The captain salutes, a salute to a prince, not a king. Edward retires to his cabin. He is exhausted, drained, but also strangely exhilarated. He believes the hard part is over. He believes he has won the woman and escaped the cage. He pours a drink, lights a cigarette, and waits for the engines to rumble to life. He does not know that the freedom he envisions is an illusion. He does not know that he is trading a public cage for a private one, a gilded cage of aimless drifting, where the woman he loves will eventually become a demanding jailer, and the lack of purpose will eat away at his soul like rust. As HMS Fury slips its moorings and heads out into the channel, the lights of England fade into the mist behind him. The broadcast is still echoing in the living rooms of the nation, the voice of the king over the water lingering like a ghost. But the man himself is gone. The radio sets are switched off, one by one, the glowing tubes dimming to black. The British people go to bed, their world slightly less magical, slightly more serious. The fairy tale is over. The king is dead. Long live the king. And somewhere in the dark, tossing on the winter sea, a small man in a greatcoat stands on the deck, looking south, believing he is sailing toward the sun, when in fact he is sailing directly into the long, slow twilight of history. As the HMS Fury dissolves into the mist of the English Channel, carrying the shadow of the former king toward France, the camera of history pans back to the shore, to the darkened windows of London, and finally rests on a man sitting alone in a room that suddenly feels too large. This is Prince Albert, Duke of York, known to his family as Bertie. In a few hours, the heralds will stand on the balcony of St. James's Palace and proclaim him King George II. But right now, he is not a monarch. He is a survivor of a shipwreck, shivering on the beach while the storm still howls. To understand the next chapter of the British monarchy, we must understand the terrifying silence that surrounds this man. For Edward, the abdication was a release, a bursting of bonds. For Bertie, it is an incarceration. He is 41 years old, a shy, chain-smoking naval officer who has spent his entire life happily standing in the shadow of his dazzling older brother. He never wanted the spotlight. he never trained for the throne. And most cruelly of all, he possesses a stammer that transforms public speaking from a duty into a physical and psychological torture. The atmosphere in London, on the morning of December 12, 1936, is not celebratory, it is hungover. The party of Edward's reign is over, and the grim reality of clean-up has begun. Bertie wakes up at 145 Piccadilly, his private home, looking, according to his own diary, like a man going to his execution. He is physically sick with anxiety. The files from this period, the private letters, the diaries of courtiers, reveal a man on the edge of a nervous breakdown. He sobs on his mother's shoulder for a solid hour. He tells his cousin, Lord Mountbatten, "I'm quite unprepared for this. I've never seen a state paper. I'm only a naval officer. It's the only thing I know about." It is a heartbreaking admission. The system that demands perfection has just handed the keys to the empire to a man who doubts his ability to say his own name without stumbling. But in the background, there is Steele. Sitting beside him, holding his shaking hand, is his wife Elizabeth, the woman history will know as the Queen Mother. If Wallis Simpson was the force that pulled Edward off the throne, Elizabeth is the anchor that will hold George VI upon it. She's small, smiling, and outwardly soft, described often as a marshmallow. But as one courtier famously noted, she's a marshmallow made of granite. She's furious. She's not angry at the constitutional crisis. She's angry at the personal cost. She blames Edward entirely. She believes, with a conviction that will never waver for the rest of her long life, that the selfishness of the elder brother has sentenced the younger brother to an early grave. In her eyes, the crown is not a gift. It is a lethal burden. And she is right. The stress of the war years, combined with the crushing weight of kingship, will eventually burn Bertie's life out like a candle in a gale. But for now, she dries his tears, straightens his tie, and pushes him gently toward the door. "We must do the thing," she implies. "We must show up." The Accession Council meets at St. James's Palace. It is a sea of old men in uniforms and mourning coats, the great and the good of the realm. They are anxious too. They have just lost the most popular king in history. They are left with the spare, the quiet one, the one with the speech impediment. When Bertie enters, the silence is heavy. He looks fragile. He is thin, his face pale and drawn. He begins to read his declaration. It is a moment of excruciating tension. Every pause, every hesitation echoes in the large room. He stammers. He fights for the words, his jaw locking, his throat tightening. But he does not stop. He pushes through the silence, forcing the vowels out by sheer will. The men in the room watch him, and slowly their anxiety turns to something else. Respect. Edward had charm, but Bertie has courage. Edward had the gift of the gab. Bertie has the gift of endurance. There is a profound shift in the tone of the monarchy here, a pivot point that saves the institution. Edward represented magic, glamour, and distance. George VI represents struggle, duty, and humanity. The public, still reeling from the shock of the abdication, begins to see something in the new king that reflects their own lives. He is not a god. He is a man doing a job he didn't ask for to the best of his ability. In the pre-war years, as the shadow of Hitler looms over Europe, this quality becomes essential. The British people don't need a playboy. They need a man who knows what it is to be afraid and yet stand his ground. However, the files hidden in the archives of the palace reveal that this transition was not just about courage, it was about management. The establishment realizes that the new king needs help. They bring in the speech therapist, Lionel Logue, an unorthodox Australian with no medical credentials but a deep understanding of the human psyche. The sessions between the king and Logue are not just voice lessons, They are therapy. They work on the breathing, yes, but they also work on the trauma. The king's stammer is the physical manifestation of his fear of his father, his fear of his brother, his fear of being not enough. Logue helps him find his voice in the literal and metaphorical sense. And there is another layer to the new reign, one that is carefully constructed by the palace press office. They begin to project an image of aggressive normality. Edward was nightclubs and cocktails. George VI is tea and firesides. Edward was solitary splendour. George VI is the family. Photographs are released of the king, the queen, and the two little princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret. They are shown playing with dogs, walking in gardens, looking like the ideal British family. It is a branding exercise of genius. It reassures the public that the chaos is over. The dangerous element has been excised. The safe element has been installed. The monarchy retreats from the precipice of celebrity and returns to the solid ground of domestic dullness. But the ghost of the brother remains. In the early days of the reign, Bertie is haunted by Edward. He calls him on the telephone, seeking advice, seeking validation. The conversations are awkward. Edward, now in Austria, is already beginning to sound like a stranger, complaining about money, complaining about titles for Wallis. Bertie listens, the receiver slippery in his sweating hand. He realises that the brother he worshipped is gone. The man on the other end of the line is a petty, embittered exile. It is a painful severance, a cutting of the cord that leaves Bertie truly alone at the top of the pyramid. One night, shortly after the accession, the new king stands by a window in Buckingham Palace, looking out at the Mall. The crowds have gone. The cheers of "Long live the king" have faded. He lights a cigarette, the smoke curling up against the cold glass. He knows what is coming. The red boxes are already piling up on his desk. The intelligence reports about Germany are getting darker. The world is sliding toward war, and he is the man who will have to tell the empire to fight. He is terrified, but he does not run. He turns away from the window, stubs out the cigarette, and walks back to the desk. He picks up a pen. He starts to read. The glamorous, dangerous, cinematic monarchy of Edward V is dead. The quiet, stammering, courageous monarchy of George VI has begun. And in the nursery down the hall, a 10-year-old girl named Elizabeth is sleeping, unaware that the weight her father now carries will, far sooner than anyone expects, be passed to her. The line of succession has bent, but it has not broken. The crown has found a safer head, even if that head lies uneasy on the pillow. The grey fog of London lifts, and the camera dissolves to the golden, honeyed light of the Loire Valley in France. It is June 1937. 6 months have passed since the abdication, 6 months of wandering, waiting, and legal wrangling. Now, we stand before the gates of the Château de Candé, a magnificent turreted fantasy of a castle rising from the French countryside. It looks like the setting for the end of a fairy tale, the place where the prince finally marries his princess, and indeed, the press of the world has gathered at the gates to capture exactly that moment. But if we move past the reporters and float through the open windows into the grand salon, the atmosphere is not one of celebration, but of a strange, echoing emptiness. This is the day Edward has fought for, the day he gave up an empire to secure. It is his wedding day. Yet, as the servants arrange the chairs and the florists adjust the massive displays of peonies and delphiniums, there is a ghost in the room. The ghost is the British royal family. To understand the bitterness of this day, we must look at a document signed just days before in London. It is a piece of parchment that acts as a final, vindictive parting gift from the establishment to its former master. King George VI acting under immense pressure from the cabinet, and his mother, Queen Mary, has issued letters patent, creating his brother the Duke of Windsor. But the document contains a sting in the tail, a clause of legal cruelty that will obsess Edward for the rest of his life. It states that while Edward is entitled to the style of His Royal Highness, his wife and descendants are not. Wallis Simpson will be a duchess, but she will never be Her Royal Highness. She will never be bowed to. She will never be royal. It is a calculated humiliation designed to mark her permanently as the other, the unsuitable woman who is tolerated but never accepted. Edward reads this document with shaking hands. He views it as an illegal act, a personal insult to the woman he has sacrificed everything for. He realizes that even in exile, the system is still reaching out to punish him. This punishment extends to the guest list. Edward had naively imagined that his brothers, Bertie, Harry and George, would attend his wedding. He thought that once the political storm had passed, the family bond would reassert itself. He was wrong. The order from Buckingham Palace is absolute. No member of the royal family is to attend. No royal cousins, no court officials. Even Edward's oldest friends find sudden excuses, diplomatic illnesses, prior engagements, travel difficulties. The King's party has evaporated. The silence from London is deafening. The chairs that should have held the Duke of York, the Duke of Gloucester, and the Duke of Kent remain empty or are filled by secretaries and local dignitaries. It is a shunning on a global stage. The message is clear. You are no longer one of us. You are an island. And yet the show must go on. The scene inside the chateau is a study in surreal contrasts. Wallis is upstairs, being zipped into her dress. It is not white. She is too smart for that. It is a shade of soft, pale blue, specifically created for her by the designer Mainbochet, a colour that will become known as Wallis blue. She looks razor sharp, elegant, and terrified. She knows the world is judging her. She knows that by marrying the former king, she is sealing her fate as the most hated woman in the British Empire. There is no turning back now. Downstairs, Edward is manic, with nervous energy, checking the flowers, checking the time. He has chosen the date, June 3rd. Apparently without realising, or perhaps not caring, that it is the birthday of his late father, King George V. To his mother, Queen Mary, this is the final insult, a dance on the grave of the old king. The family in London spends the day in grim silence, ignoring the telegrams from France. The ceremony itself provides a moment of unexpected drama. The Church of England has refused to sanction the marriage. No bishop will come. No priest is allowed to officiate. It looks as if the joke will have to be married by a French civil servant, a dry, bureaucratic ending to the great romance. But at the last minute, a rogue element appears. The Reverend R. Anderson Jardine, a vicar from a poor parish in Darlington, steps forward. He is a small, unknown man who believes that the church is being unchristian in its rejection of the couple. He defies his bishop, defies the Archbishop of Canterbury, and travels to France on his own dime to offer his services. When he arrives at the chateau, Edward is so grateful he almost weeps. It is the one piece of spiritual legitimacy he craved. Jardine stands before the makeshift altar, a lone figure of rebellion in a surplice, reading the words of the Book of Common Prayer. "Wilt thou have this woman to be thy wedded wife?" "I will," Edward answers. His voice, usually so clear, is thick with emotion. He sounds like a man clinging to a life raft. "Wilt thou have this man to be thy wedded husband?" "I will," says Wallis. Her voice is steady, controlled. She is the spine of the couple now. She is the one who has to hold him up. As the rings are exchanged, a strange sensation settles over the room. It is the feeling of a door locking. They are married. The crisis is technically over. But as they turn to face the small congregation, the lack of applause from the absent family echoes loudly. There is no "God save the King." There is no carriage ride through cheering streets. There's only the polite clapping of a few loyal friends, the flash of cameras, and the scratching of reporters' pencils. They walk out onto the terrace, into the blinding sunshine. The photographers shout for them. "Look this way, Your Royal Highness. Look this way, Duchess." They smile. They hold hands. They look like the perfect couple. But if you look closely at the newsreel footage, you can see the tension in Edward's jaw, the hardness in Wallis's eyes. They have won, but the victory feels hollow. They have each other, but they have lost everything else. The wedding breakfast is an affair of exquisite food and forced gaiety. The guests drink champagne and toast the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, but the conversation keeps drifting back to the empty chairs. Everyone knows who isn't there. The absence of the brothers is a physical weight in the room. It transforms the wedding from a celebration into a protest. It is us against the world now. Edward, champagne glass in hand, looks at his new wife with an adoration that is almost uncomfortable to witness. He has given her his name, his protection, and his life, but he cannot give her the one thing she arguably wants most: acceptance. The title HRH is the forbidden fruit, and its absence will become the obsession of their exile, the scab they will pick at for 35 years. As the sun sets over the Loire, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of the chateau, the Duke and Duchess prepare to leave for their honeymoon. They are heading to Austria, to a castle, to begin their life of wandering. The luggage is loaded, trunk after trunk of clothes, jewels, and memories. They get into the car. The few guests wave goodbye. The car drives down the long avenue of trees, growing smaller and smaller until it disappears. The gates of the Chateau de Condé swing shut. The reporters pack up their cameras. The show is over. Back in London, King George VI sits in his study. He has spent the day thinking of his brother. He loves him, but he fears him. He knows that the shadow court across the water is a threat. He knows that Edward will not go quietly into the night. And he is right. The wedding was not an ending. It was the beginning of a long, slow war of attrition between the Windsors and the palace. The files are not closed. They are just beginning a new volume, and the first entry in that new volume is dark indeed. For the owner of the Chateau de Condé, the man who hosted the wedding, is a distinct character named Charles Bedaux, a man with very close, very troubling ties to the Nazi regime in Germany. The wedding guests have gone, but the new friends are waiting, and they are not wearing mourning coats, they are wearing swastikas. The honeymoon is about to lead the Duke and Duchess into the darkest shadow of the 20th century. The honeymoon is over, and the long, hollow reality of exile has begun. We find the Duke and Duchess of Windsor in the autumn of 1937, drifting through the luxury hotels of Europe like ghosts in diamond jewellery. They are wealthy, they are famous, and they are bored. Edward, a man whose entire life was scheduled in 15-minute increments by the machinery of the state, suddenly wakes up with nothing to do. No red boxes, no factory visits, no empire to govern. He is a man of energy, with nowhere to put it. And Wallis, now the Duchess, feels the sting of their isolation. She is denied the title of Her Royal Highness by the British court, but she is hungry for the respect she feels she is owed. They are looking for a stage. They are looking for a red carpet, and tragically, the only regime in Europe willing to roll one out for them is the one preparing to burn the continent down. Enter the darker currents of history. The man who orchestrated their wedding, the industrialist Charles Bedaux, whispers a suggestion: why not visit Germany? The Third Reich is rising. It is modern, dynamic, and, Beddoe assures them, eager to honour the former King of England. Edward listens. He views himself as a diplomat, a man who can bridge the gap between Britain and Germany. He believes, with a fatal arrogance, that he can stop the coming war simply by talking to Hitler, man to man. He does not see himself as a traitor. He sees himself as a peacemaker. But the British government sees something very different. They see a loose cannon rolling toward a powder keg. In October 1937, the Duke and Duchess board a train for Berlin. As they pull into the Friedrichstrasse station, the scene that greets them is a terrifying inversion of a royal tour. There are crowds, yes, thousands of them, cheering wildly, but the flags waving in the crisp autumn air are not the Union Jack, they are the swastika. The men guarding the platform are not the red-coated Grenadier Guards, they are the black-uniformed SS, skulls glinting on their caps. Edward steps off the train, and for the first time since his abdication, he is treated like a king. Nazi officials bow low. They address Wallis as Your Royal Highness, the very phrase King George VI has forbidden. It is a seduction of the highest order. The Nazis know exactly where the Windsor's vanity lies, and they feed it with silver spoons. The tour that follows is a propaganda masterclass. The newsreels capture the Duke and Duchess touring factories, inspecting housing projects, and smiling at blonde, blue-eyed children. Edward is impressed. He sees efficiency. He sees a country that has pulled itself out of economic ruin. He does not look, or chooses not to see, the shadow of the concentration camps, the persecution of the Jews, or the brutal suppression of dissent. There is a photograph from this trip that remains one of the most shocking images in the Royal Archive. It shows the Duke of Windsor, the former King Emperor, surrounded by grinning Nazi officers. He is not just observing, he looks comfortable. He looks at home. But the centerpiece of the visit is the pilgrimage to the mountain. On October 22nd, the couple is driven up the winding Alpine roads to the Berghof, Hitler's private retreat in the Bavarian Alps. The atmosphere is Wagnerian, mist-shrouded peaks, pine forests, and the palpable tension of approaching the heart of the spider's web. Hitler waits for them on the steps. The meeting is surreal. The dictator kisses Wallis's hand. He is charming, playing the role of the respectful statesman. He and Edward retreat for a private conversation. What was said in that room remains one of history's great mysteries. No transcript exists. Edward later claimed they discussed housing and the welfare of the working man. But German files, captured after the war, suggest a darker dialogue. They suggest Edward criticised the British government. They suggest he hinted that if he were still king, Germany and Britain would be allies, not enemies. Hitler, for his part, tells his aides later that Wallis would have made a good queen. She has the air of a dictator, he remarks, a compliment in his eyes, a condemnation in everyone else's. And then, the moment that stops the breath. As they leave, or perhaps at a reception earlier in the tour, there are reports and grainy footage that appear to show the Duke giving a version of the Nazi salute. He claimed later it was merely a wave, or a polite gesture of respect to the national anthem of his hosts. But to the eyes of the world, it looks like capitulation. It looks like the former head of the British Empire acknowledging the supremacy of the Führer. In London, the reaction is one of nausea. King George VI is horrified. Queen Elizabeth is vindicated in her hatred. The intelligence services are in a state of high alarm. They realise that Edward is not just a nuisance. He is a potential weapon. The German file in Whitehall grows thicker. But the true danger is hidden in the files in Berlin. The Nazis are taking notes. They are building a profile. They see Edward's bitterness, his vanity, his anger at his brother. They begin to formulate a plan that will eventually be codenamed Operation Willy. The idea is simple and terrifying. When Germany conquers Britain, they will remove George VI and reinstate Edward of Wraith as a puppet king with Wallis as his queen. They believe he will keep Britain neutral, or perhaps even allied with the Reich. The Duke, in their eyes, is the key to the back door of the British Empire. The tour is a disaster for the Windsors' reputation in the places that matter. In America, where they had hoped to live, or at least tour next, the public opinion turns overnight. The Jewish community, the labour unions, and the liberal press are outraged. The King of Love has become the King of the Nazis. The planned tour of the United States is cancelled. The Windsors return to France, bewildered. They do not understand why their peace mission has been met with such hostility. They retreat into a bubble of victimhood, blaming the Bolsheviks and the jealous British government for poisoning the well, but the files remain. They are stored in the archives of the German Foreign Office, telegrams from ambassadors, notes from the Berghof, assessments of the Duke's psychological state. These are the Marburg files, documents that will be hunted down by Allied intelligence officers in the ruins of 1945. Documents so explosive that Winston Churchill will later try to suppress them to protect the dignity of the crown. They tell a story of a man who was so blinded by his own ego that he allowed himself to be used as a pawn by the greatest evil of the 20th century. As the winter of 1937 sets in, the Duke and Duchess are back in Paris, the adrenaline of the Berlin trip fading. They are alone again. The telephone does not ring with offers of ambassadorships. The British government has frozen them out completely. The German stain is now indelible. Edward has crossed a line from which there is no return. He is no longer just the brother across the water. He is a man who shook hands with the devil. The camera pulls back from their lit apartment window in Paris, leaving them to their bridge games and their cocktails, while in the east, the man they had tea with begins to look at the map of Europe and sharpen his knife. The storm is coming, and when it breaks, the Windsors will find themselves in a position far more precarious than social exile. They will be refugees in a world at war, caught between the country that rejected them and the enemy that wants to own them. This segment exposes how exile distorts judgment. Edward does not become dangerous because he is evil, but because he is idle. Power once disciplined him. Exile dissolves the boundaries that told him when to stop speaking, smiling, or trusting. In that vacuum, flattery becomes fuel. The Nazis understand this instinctively. They do not recruit him with ideology, but with recognition. There is a soft echo here of Napoleon III after his fall, another dethroned ruler drifting through Europe, convinced he still mattered, still believing history might call him back. In both cases, exile preserved the ego, but removed the guardrails. The result was illusion mistaken for influence. Why this matters is that authoritarian regimes are often less interested in loyalty than in leverage. Edward is valuable not because he agrees with Hitler, but because he believes he is acting independently. Some historians argue the Berlin visit was naive rather than sinister, a product of the era's confusion before war clarified moral lines. That may be fair, yet naivete, when combined with resentment and visibility, can be weaponized. In the quiet rooms of Paris, the Windsors imagine themselves wronged lovers of history. In Berlin, they are already being catalogued, assessed, and prepared for use. Exile, once romantic, has become a corridor, one that leads not back to relevance but deeper into compromise. The sky over Europe has turned the colour of ash. It is May 1940, and the phony war has ended with the screech of Stuka dive bombers. The German army is rolling across France like a tide of grey steel, and amidst the millions of refugees clogging the roads, a particular convoy of cars is fleeing south. Inside are the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, their pugs, and a mountain of luggage containing silver, porcelain, and enough clothes to outfit a regiment. They are running for their lives, but they are also running into a geopolitical trap. They eventually reach neutral Portugal, settling in a villa near Lisbon. Here, the air is thick with intrigue. Lisbon in 1940 is the spy capital of the world, a nest of vipers where British agents drink in the same bars as Gestapo officers. And the prize everyone is fighting for is the former King of England. This is the moment where the files become deadly. In Berlin, the plan known as Operation Willy is activated. The Nazis do not just want to be friends with the Duke, they want to kidnap him. Or better yet, persuade him to come willingly. German agents surround the villa, whispering poison into the Duke's ear. They tell him the British government wants to kill him. They tell him that if he stays in Europe, Germany will restore him to his throne once they have conquered London. It is a seductive song for a man who feels discarded by his own family. Edward listens. He delays his departure. He sends telegrams to London demanding conditions be met before he returns to British soil. He is playing a dangerous game of brinkmanship while the fate of the free world hangs in the balance. In London, Winston Churchill is now Prime Minister. He loves the King, but he has no patience for the Duke's vanity in the middle of a war. He reads the intelligence reports from Lisbon with growing horror. He realises that Edward is a liability who could be used to destroy national morale. A decision is made, cold and hard as iron. The Duke must be removed from the European theatre. He must be sent somewhere far away, somewhere safe, and somewhere irrelevant. Churchill offers him the governorship of the Bahamas. It sounds like a job. In reality, it is a sentence. The Bahamas in 1940 is not a playground for billionaires. It is a small, impoverished, sun-baked colony, thousands of miles from the action. It is a golden prison. Edward tries to refuse. He calls it a third-rate appointment, but Churchill is done negotiating. He sends a telegram that essentially threatens the Duke with court-martial if he does not board the ship. The velvet glove is off. The Duke and Duchess are ushered onto the American export liner Excalibur, another ironic name for a king who has lost his sword. As the ship leaves the coast of Portugal, the German agents watch from the dock, their plot foiled by a matter of hours. The Windsors are heading west into the heat. They arrive in Nassau in August 1940. The heat hits them like a physical blow. The air is heavy, humid, and humming with mosquitoes. Government House, their new residence, is a far cry from Fort Belvedere or the Chateau of France. It is shabby, the paint peeling, the furniture riddled with termites. Wallis takes one look at it and despairs. She calls it this Elba, a reference to Napoleon's place of exile. For the next 5 years, this small island will be their universe. The man who once ruled an empire that covered a quarter of the globe is now in charge of a few thousand islanders, a struggling sponge industry, and a calendar of small-town garden parties. The Bahamas file is perhaps the saddest of all the intelligence dossiers. It documents a man shrinking. Edward, bored and bitter, obsesses over petty protocol. He fights battles about the temperature of the water in his swimming pool while London burns during the Blitz. He insists that everyone bow and curtsy to Wallis, creating awkward scenes at local dinners. He expresses views that are deeply racist, complaining about the local black population in language that is repellent even for the time. He is a small man in a small pond, thrashing around in his own unhappiness. But the danger has not entirely passed. Even in the Bahamas, the Duke continues to talk. He gives an interview to Liberty magazine in which he says, it would be a tragedy for the world if Hitler was overthrown. He suggests that America should not enter the war. These comments filter back to London and Washington, causing fury. President Roosevelt orders the FBI to watch the Duke. The British censors read his mail. They find that he is using a Swedish intermediary to send messages that might reach Germany. There is a persistent fear that he is still trying to negotiate a peace deal behind Churchill's back, a peace that would leave Hitler in power and perhaps restore Edward to a puppet throne. The governor of the Bahamas is technically the king's representative, but he is treated by his own government as a security risk, watched by spies in his own garden. Life in Nassau is a strange mix of torpor and scandal. The biggest event of their tenure is the unsolved murder of Sir Harry Oakes, a wealthy gold prospector and friend of the Duke. Oakes is found bludgeoned to death and burned in his bed during a thunderstorm. The Duke attempts to manage the investigation himself, bringing in detectives from Miami rather than Scotland Yard, fearing that a proper investigation might uncover financial improprieties involving the laundering of money, perhaps even Nazi money, through the Bahamas. The case becomes a chaotic mess, a noir mystery of corruption and incompetence that stains the Duke's reputation further. He looks less like a governor and more like a character in a Graham Greene novel, sweating in a linen suit, surrounded by secrets he cannot control. And there is Wallis. She hates Nassau with a burning passion. The heat ruins her hair. The mosquitoes bite her ankles. She's bored out of her mind. She writes letters to her aunt in America that are dripping with venom about the shabby locals and the dull life. She spends her time ordering clothes from New York, redesigning the interior of Government House, and nursing her husband's fragile ego. They are locked together in the heat, two people who sacrificed the world for each other, and now have nothing else left. The romance has become a routine of mutual dependence. They cling to each other because there is no one else who understands the height from which they have fallen. As the war in Europe turns the tide, Stalingrad, D-Day, the fall of Berlin, the Windsors watch from afar. Irrelevant. The world is being remade without them. The heroic narrative of the war belongs to Bertie and Elizabeth, who stayed in London, who walked through the rubble of the Blitz, who became the symbols of national resistance. Edward is just a footnote, a man in a white dinner jacket drinking cocktails in the tropics, waiting for the news to come over the wireless. When the war finally ends in 1945, there is no triumphal return for the governor. He resigns his post as soon as he can. He shakes the sand of the Bahamas from his shoes and heads back to France. But he returns to a Europe that has changed. The old kings are gone. The new order has no place for him. He is 50 years old, but his life's work is over. The exile to the golden tropics has saved his life, but it has finished his reputation. He drifts back to Paris, not as a returning hero, but as a relic, a man who missed the boat of history and was left stranded on the shore. The blinding white light of the Bahamian sun fades into the soft amber glow of a Parisian street lamp. We have moved forward in time, drifting gently through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, landing on the cobblestones of the Bois de Boulogne. The war is over, the rubble has been cleared, and the world is rebuilding itself with concrete, rock and roll, and television. But here, at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement, time has stopped. This is the Villa Windsor, the final and most elaborate stage set of the Duke and Duchess's long exile. It is a mansion that feels less like a home and more like a museum, dedicated to a reign that never happened. The camera glides through the heavy iron gates, past the manicured topiaries that stand like silent sentries, and into the entrance hall. The air smells of beeswax, expensive potpourri, and the faint chemically sharp scent of pug dogs. This is the era of the Café Society, a floating world of rich Americans deposed European aristocrats and fashion designers who moved between Paris, New York, and the Riviera, trying to outrun their own boredom. And at the centre of this spinning carousel sit Edward and Wallis, the king and queen of the idle rich. Life in the Villa Windsor is governed by a discipline that is terrifying in its precision. Having lost the British Empire, the Duke has decided to rule his household with the same rigidity he once applied to the Royal Navy. The staff, dressed in royal livery, move in total silence. The table settings are measured with a ruler. The temperature of the rooms is monitored constantly. It is a microcosm of control in a life that has spun out of control. Edward, now aging, his golden hair turning silver, has become a man of small obsessions. He spends hours gardening, not with the joy of a hobbyist, but with the fussiness of a curator. He organises his wardrobe, his medals, his papers. He is a man trying to fill the void of duty with the busy work of existence. He has become a sad parody of a monarch, inspecting the silverware because he is no longer allowed to inspect the fleet. Wallis, meanwhile, has hardened into an icon of terrifying chic. She is the best-dressed woman in the world, a title she wears like armour. "I'm not a beautiful woman," she famously says, "so I have to dress better than anyone else." Her closet is a vault of couture, Dior, Givenchy, Balenciaga. Her jewellery box is legendary, filled with pieces designed by the Duke, animals made of emeralds and diamonds that prowl across her wrists. But the files and the memoirs of their friends reveal a coldness behind the sparkle. The romance has curdled into a dependency. Wallis is often sharp with the Duke. She snaps at him at dinner parties. She rolls her eyes when he tells the same old stories about his time as Prince of Wales. Guests are sometimes shocked to see the former King of England following her around like a nervous servant, desperate for a smile that rarely comes. The romance of the century has become a marriage of endurance. They are locked together by history. They cannot separate because to do so would be to admit that the sacrifice was for nothing. They must keep dancing the waltz, even though the music stopped years ago. The defining moment of this twilight era comes in 1952 and 1953. In London, King George VI dies. The brother who carried the burden Edward dropped is worn out, his heart stopping in his sleep at Sandringham. Edward travels to London for the funeral alone. Wallis is not invited. It is a stark reminder that the grudge held by the Queen Mother has not softened with death. Edward walks in the procession, a small grieving figure in a long coat, looking like a ghost from another era. He is respectful, but he is an outsider. He stays at his mother's home, Marlborough House, and writes letters to Wallis, complaining about the cold and the food. He is a tourist in his own kingdom. Then comes the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in June 1953. It is the dawn of the new Elizabethan age, a moment of national renewal. But in Paris, the television set is turned on in the Villa Windsor, and the curtains are drawn. The Duke and Duchess are not there. They were not invited. The official reason is that it is contrary to protocol for a former sovereign to attend the crowning of a new one. The real reason is that the establishment does not want the distraction. They do not want the camera to cut away from the radiant young queen to the sad, aging uncle in the third row. So Edward watches his niece take the holy vows he once mocked. He watches the crown, St. Edward's crown, the heavy gold circlet named after his ancestor, being placed on her head. We can only imagine the silence in that room in Paris. Does he feel regret? Does he feel relief? He smokes a cigarette, perhaps adjusting the Windsor knot of his tie. A fashion myth, by the way, as he never used that knot, preferring a thick four-in-hand tie to achieve the look, and offers a commentary to his guests. He plays the expert. "She's doing that well," he says. "The Archbishop is a bit slow there. Muck." He tries to sound detached, but the pain is visible in his eyes. The world has moved on. The crown is secure. He is forgotten. The years drift by in a haze of parties. They go to the Lido. They go to Maxime's. They cruise on yachts in the Mediterranean. They are photographed constantly, their faces masks of frozen gaiety. But the files of the era, the diaries of frantic social climbers and weary hostesses, reveal the hollowness of it all. The Windsors are professional guests. They sing for their supper with their presence. You must come to dinner. The Duke and Duchess will be there. It is a transaction. They provide the glamour. The hosts provide the money and the audience. It is a shallow existence for a man who was trained to read state papers, and a tiring one for a woman who just wanted security. There are darker whispers too. The Jimmy Donahue affair. For a few years in the early 1950s, the couple is inseparable from a wealthy, flamboyant American heir named Jimmy Donahue. He is decades younger, scandalous, and irreverent. Rumours fly that he and Wallis are having an affair right under the Duke's nose. Whether physical or merely emotional, the intimacy humiliates Edward. He sits up late waiting for them to come home from nightclubs. He looks lost. Eventually, the friendship explodes and Donahue is banished. But the damage is done. It exposes the fragility of the perfect love. The fairy tale has cracks in the porcelain. As the 1960s arrive, the shadows lengthen in the Bois de Boulogne. The music changes from jazz to the Beatles. But the Windsors do not change. They are trapped in amber, living in a perpetual 1930s. The Duke's health begins to fail. The sharp blue eyes that once charmed the empire begin to dim. He undergoes eye surgeries. He develops a heart condition. He walks with a stoop. The boy king is finally becoming an old man. And Wallis? She is terrified of illness, terrified of death. She keeps the house filled with flowers, as if to drown out the smell of mortality. She keeps the parties going, louder and brighter, trying to pretend that the twilight is not turning into night. They become relics, curiosities to be pointed at in restaurants. Look, that's him. That's the man who gave it all up. They are famous, yes, but they are no longer relevant. They are a cautionary tale told in hushed tones. The cafe society is dying out, replaced by a new generation that doesn't care about protocol or titles. The world that Edward and Wallis built for themselves, a world of surfaces, of appearances, of style over substance, is evaporating. The files in London are gathering dust, the secrets of the abdication safely buried under 30 years of silence. The intelligence agents have stopped watching. There is no need anymore. The Duke is not a threat. He is just a frail old man walking his pugs in the park, waiting for the final curtain to fall. The camera lingers on them, sitting on a bench in the autumn leaves, two small figures against the grey sky, holding hands, not out of passion, but out of fear of the dark. The long party is ending. The bill is about to come due. The long twilight finally deepens into night. It is May 1972, and the Villa Windsor in the Bois de Boulogne has gone quiet. The parties are over. The music has stopped. The pugs are sleeping in their baskets. Upstairs, in a bedroom dominated by the smell of medicine and fading lilies, the man who was once King Emperor is dying. Edward VIII, now 77 years old, is being consumed by throat cancer, a cruel, ironic end for a man whose voice had once captivated the world on the radio. He is frail, weighing less than 100 pounds, a shadow of the Golden Prince who dazzled the 1920s. But even in these final hours, the protocol remains. The files of his life are being packed away, but there is one final entry to be made, one last meeting between the rebel and the crown. Queen Elizabeth II, his niece, is coming to Paris on a state visit. She has agreed to see him. It is a gesture of reconciliation, or perhaps just a final act of Christian duty. But for Edward, It is the validation he has craved for 35 years. The scene of their meeting is one of the most poignant in royal history. The Duke insists on getting out of bed. He insists on being dressed. He wants to stand to receive his sovereign. His doctors forbid it. His body cannot support it. A compromise is reached. He sits in a chair, dressed in a blazer and cravat, tubes hidden as best as possible. When the Queen enters the room, the dying man attempts to bow. It is a painful, trembling motion, a final surrender of the ego to the institution. The Queen speaks to him gently. Wallis is there too, nervous, fluttery, her face a mask of strain. The meeting is short. There is no grand apology, no rewriting of the past. There is just the quiet acknowledgement of blood and the approaching end. As the Queen leaves, the Duke watches her go, tears in his eyes. He knows he will not see England again with living eyes. 10 days later, on May 28th, 1972, the Duke of Windsor dies. The boy king is gone, and immediately the machinery of the British state, which had expelled him, swings into action to reclaim him. A Royal Air Force jet is dispatched to Paris to bring the body home. It is a strange repatriation. The man who lived in exile returns as cargo. He is to lie in state at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, the very place where he broadcast his abdication speech. The crowds file past the coffin, but the mood is not one of deep grief. It is one of curiosity and distant respect. To the new generation, he is a figure from a history book, a myth rather than a memory. But the true tragedy of the final act belongs to Wallis. She flies to England for the funeral, staying at Buckingham Palace, the very house she was forbidden to enter for decades. She's 75, bewildered, and suffering from the onset of arteriosclerosis. She's medicated, fragile, and utterly alone in the heart of the enemy camp. The photographs from the funeral show a woman peering out from behind a black veil, looking at the royal family with eyes that seem to see nothing. The Queen Mother is there, the woman who blamed Wallis for everything. Do they speak? Barely. There's a frost between them that even death cannot melt. Wallis stands by the open grave at Frogmore, the royal burial ground in Windsor Great Park. She watches the coffin lowered into the earth. She is burying her life's work. Without him, she has no status, no purpose, no definition. She returns to the palace, eats a solitary dinner, and flies back to Paris the next day. She will never set foot in England again. For the next 14 years, Wallis Simpson lives on, but it is a life in name only. She retreats into the Villa Windsor, the gates locked tight. Slowly, the lights in her mind begin to flicker and go out. Dementia sets in. She forgets she was a duchess. She forgets she was the most hated woman in the empire. She becomes a prisoner of her own house, bedridden, cared for by nurses and lawyers who manage her dwindling fortune. The silence of the villa becomes absolute. The love story of the century ends, not with a bang, but with a long, slow fade into oblivion. She dies in 1986, a relic of a bygone age. Her body is flown to England to be buried next to Edward at Frogmore. Finally, they are together, side by side under the plane trees, united in the soil of the country that would not let them live together. The irony is complete. In death, they are absorbed back into the establishment, becoming just two more names on the royal roll call. Their rebellion smoothed over by the quiet grass of Windsor. And what of the files? What of the secrets? After their deaths, the closed box of their lives is pried open by historians. The Marburg files are released. The intelligence reports from the 1930s are declassified. The world learns about the Nazi connections, the currency schemes, the deep selfishness of the abdication. The myth of the great romance begins to crack. We see now that the abdication was not just a tragedy of love, it was a narrow escape for the British nation. If Edward had stayed on the throne, with his sympathies for Germany and his disregard for the Constitution, the history of World War II might have been terrifyingly different. The system, that cold, unfeeling machine, had protected itself, and in doing so, it had protected the world. The love story was the sugar coating on a very bitter pill. Yet, as we stand over their graves in the quiet of the Royal Burial Ground, the judgment of history softens just a little. We see two flawed, damaged human beings who found in each other the only safety they ever knew. We see a king who was never meant to be king, and a woman who got more than she bargained for. The files tell us the facts, the dates, the betrayals, the risks, but they cannot capture the feeling of the hand holding the hand, the shared cigarette in the rain, the desperate need to be understood. The Abdication Crisis was a warning, yes. It was a scar on the monarchy, but it was also a profoundly human story about the terrifying cost of choosing your own path. The camera pulls back now, rising high above the trees of Frogmore, high above the grey stone towers of Windsor Castle. The figures of the past, Baldwin, Lang, Churchill, Bertie, Elizabeth, Edward and Wallis, are all gone. The red boxes are closed. The telegrams are silent. The Sandringham time clocks have been reset to the correct hour. The storm of 1936 has passed into the history books, its thunder reduced to a whisper. The monarchy survived, the silence held, and the files, finally, have been read. The story is told. The ghost of the king who left has faded into the mist, leaving behind only the echo of a voice on the radio, wishing us all a better version of happiness than the one he found. The rain is over. The rest is silence. The heavy leather covers of the history books are closed now. The dust settles in the archives, and the voices of the ministers and the monarchs fade back into the quiet hum of the past. The year 1936 is a distant memory, a ripple in the great river of time that flows on, endless and deep. Let the tension of the crisis dissolve from your shoulders. The arguments are over. The decisions have been made. There is no more need to choose, no more need to worry about thrones or crowns or the judgment of the world. Imagine the snow falling softly over the gardens at Sandringham, covering the tracks of the past in a blanket of pristine white. Imagine the moonlight reflecting off the dark waters of the Thames, a silver path leading to nowhere but peace. The world is turning slowly, safely, in the velvet dark. You are safe here, far away from the cold winds of history. The files are locked away. The secrets are sleeping. There is only the rhythm of your own breathing, steady and calm, like the ticking of a clock that keeps its own perfect time. Let the story drift away like smoke. Let the heavy curtains fall, the camera stops, the light dims, the night is yours. Sweet dreams.